Hi, and welcome to the Origins Podcast. I'm your host, Lawrence Krauss. In this episode, I had a rollicking good time with two amazing intellects and two amazing intellectuals. People I've been thinking about having on the program for an incredible time. Two people you would think would be as disparate as you could imagine, but in fact, they teach a class together at Princeton. And there's a book that's just come out called Truth Matters, a dialogue on fruitful disagreement in an age of division. And the topic really captured me because that's one of the points of the Origins podcast and the Origins Foundation is to lead fruitful and respectful dialogues about topics that are important and sometimes inconvenient and sensitive. But that's what learning and scholarship is all about. Now, Robert George and Cornel West on the surface could not be more different. Robert George is a distinguished professor of jurisprudence, well-known conservative scholar, if you want, at Princeton, and Cornel West is a well-known progressive. He's also a professor of philosophy and Christian practice at the Union Theological Seminary, and this progressive left wing, if you want to call it that, intellectual, and this conservative intellectual come together to have fascinating discussions. And I came in sort of as a third wheel, because in fact, what is kind of interesting is that both Robert George and Cornel West, while they differ in many things, also have many similarities. They both study social sciences and humanities. They're both Christians. One's a Catholic, one's a Protestant. And it was fun to have a discussion to confront them with some of the things they talk about as someone who comes in as a scientist with very different sensibilities, also as an atheist and someone who grew up Jewish. And we just had the most fun, and it was one of the most enjoyable podcasts I've done in a long time. I really love these guys, and they were a lot of fun. And the topics we delved into are very deep in philosophy, in theology, in modern society, and there were no holds barred. I think you'll really find this discussion fascinating and certainly provocative. I'd love to have them on again. And it was a good example of exactly what they talk about, how you can disagree fruitfully and try and together lead your way to what the truth is, recognizing that you might be wrong. And we all, I hope, exhibited that during the podcast. I hope you enjoy it. You can watch it ad-free on our Critical Mass Substack site, and if you subscribe to that site, the proceeds will go to support the Origins Project Foundation, the nonprofit foundation that produces this podcast. Or you can watch it on our YouTube channel, and I hope you'll subscribe to that if you do. Or you can listen to it on any podcast listening site. No matter how you watch it or listen to it, I think you'll find this incredibly entertaining and thought-provoking and provocative as well, which is really, in some sense, what this podcast is all about. With no further ado, Robert George and Cornel West. Thank you, Robert George and Cornel West, two intellectual heroes together in one place. I'm so excited to be doing this with you. It's going to be so much fun.
Well, we are the ones who are thoroughly blessed to be on your show. And
well, we're all blessed, I guess, in that sense. And I'm happy to even use the word blessed for the moment. I respect both of your intellects so much, and as I was telling you beforehand, I feel like I've had this dialogue with you already. This is the book that we'll be talking about, and every page is marked, sometimes with exclamation marks, because I was talking to both of you, sometimes yelling in the middle of the night. The most fun for me, and we'll hopefully get to a few of these points, is when I mean, sometimes one of you is wrong and sometimes another is wrong, but sometimes I'm really excited that both of you are wrong. So
that's probably most of the time, Dr. Krauss. That's probably most of the time. You got a couple of cracked vessels here.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I mean, every now and then maybe even I'm wrong, so we'll see. But, I want to spend, because there's so much to do here, I want to spend a lot of time talking about the incredible ideas. Really, I want to just have a discussion that mirrors the discussion you had, a fun intellectual discussion of ideas. And we'll get there. But you may not have seen the podcast before, but this is an Origins podcast. And before we do anything, I really like to find out how people got to where they are now, or at least at the beginning of their well-known, both of you are well-known intellectuals, academics, and I don't have to cover your academic career, but I like to find out how people got to where they are. So I'm going to start with you, George, for a moment, just to see. I want to go back, way back. So you're a child of immigrants, right? Your father
That's
was
correct. Yeah.
Syrian, and
Yes,
and mother was Italian.
that's correct. Yeah. Southern
Now, were
Italy,
they
Calabria.
working class? Had either of them gone to college or
No, both of my grandfathers were coal miners. Those were the immigrants, one from
okay.
Southern Italy, one from
Uh,
Syria. Um, Really, Dr. Cross, what saved me from the coal mines was World War II. Now, I wasn't born until a decade after the end of
yeah.
World War II, but my father was drafted at age 18 in 1944, right out of high school. He hadn't even finished high school. They later sent his parents a diploma, and he went off to fight in Normandy and Brittany. And then when the war was over, he served afterward for a while in the occupation army. He came back, and of course, he had those military skills, and he had new opportunities. He had a booming economy. So although he didn't have the opportunity to go to college, his circumstances didn't
GI
allow
Bill
for
didn't
that.
work for him, I guess.
Yeah, well, couldn't take advantage of the GI Bill because of family circumstances. But it meant he didn't have to go into the coal mines, as a result of which,
Yeah.
I'm not in the coal mines. But I grew up with parents who had been high school educated, but not college educated. I was the first in my family to go to college. My parents were very keen that we go to college. There were five of us, all boys. I was the first. So I was the pioneer, first one out there.
Yeah.
But my boyhood was very much a kind of Huck. I describe it as a Huck Finn boyhood. I was in the hills of Appalachia, in the heart of West Virginia, growing up, hunting and fishing and playing bluegrass music. As Cornel knows, I'm still a very avid and active bluegrass banjo player. I do some performing, and Cornel and I do some singing together.
We should have had you perform, both of you here, but anyway, go on.
Well, he's a Grammy winner. I'm not
Yeah,
a
I know.
Grammy winner.
No.
Brother
By the
Cornel's
way,
a
I don't
Grammy
want to point out I was nominated for a Grammy, but that's a different thing. Anyway. I didn't win. But anyway, go on.
So then
I have no musical ability. I should point that out as well.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
When I was 18 years old, I went off to college. I ended up going off to Swarthmore College, but I was very badly behind my fellow students. I sometimes put it this way: you've heard of people who don't know anything. I didn't even suspect anything, and there were all these kids there from Andover and Exeter and Groton and St. Paul's and these great public high schools at Chevy Chase, Maryland, and Bethesda and so forth, and they just seemed to know everything. They had heard of.
Why did you choose Swarthmore then? I mean, you must have known something about. You chose a private liberal arts college.
Well, let me explain that to you then.
Okay.
So my mother, although she was not herself college educated, had it in her head that there were better colleges for her sons out of state, and that we should go out of state to college so we could attend a better college. Now, she couldn't have told you what the better colleges were. She wouldn't have been able to say whether Harvard would be better than Oklahoma State or what, but she knew that there were better universities and colleges out of state. So senior year, I went in as the rest of my class did. At least those in our class who were going on to college. A lot of my classmates didn't go on to college. Some went into the mines, for example. But I went in to see the guidance counselor. Her name was Mrs. Simons. I remember her very well. She was, I think, the girls' volleyball coach and the chemistry teacher. But she was also the college guidance counselor. And I explained that my mother was interested in having us go out of state to college. And she had very little experience at sending students out of state. Basically, with a college-bound student, she would look at your record and say, well, you've got a good record. You should go to West Virginia University, the flagship state university. Then if your record wasn't so good or you needed some remedial help, she'd send you to one of the satellite state universities. But in my case, since I said that I wanted to go out of state, she initially resisted that, by the way. She said, well, why would you want to do that? We've got a very good university right in town. She said, if you go out of state, that's expensive. Even if you go to a public university, you're going to pay out of state rates. Why would your mother want you to do that? And I said, well, she just does. And so she just, having very little experience herself sending people away to college, she just handed me a book, a great big fat book. Cornel, you'll remember it. Thicker than the Bible. It's called Barron's College Guide. And she handed me that book and she said, here, this explains all about the different colleges. And I looked at it, and there are 3,000 profiles of various colleges. And I said to myself, I can't read 3,000 profiles of colleges. But I'm leafing through, sitting in Mrs. Simon's office. And I notice in the front, they had the colleges, the book had the colleges classified by how selective or competitive the admissions was. So in the very top category, it was most competitive, and then under that, highly competitive and very competitive. And I noticed in the most competitive category, there were, I think, 12, if I recall correctly, 12 colleges and universities, 6 of the Ivies, all but Cornell and Penn in those days, Stanford, MIT, Caltech, and then 3 other colleges, Amherst, Swarthmore, and Williams, none of which I'd ever heard of. But I thought, well, I can read 12 profiles. So I read the profiles, and, I figured out that 3 of these were small colleges. And I said to myself, Robbie, small college, that's good. For a kid like you, a hick from the hills in West Virginia, if you go to a small college, you won't get lost and they'll take care of you. You go to a large university, who knows what's going to happen to you. So my folks took me on the tour. We got in the pickup truck. It was a crew cab pickup truck, which was unusual in those days, a truck with 2 front and back seat. And we went around to see these colleges. And I don't know if you've ever been to Swarthmore. I know Cornell has. It is the most beautiful place in the world. It is literally in an arboretum. Literally in an arboretum.
Yeah,
so we went there, and not only was it beautiful and had beautiful buildings, I had an individual tour that you didn't go with a group. If you were a prospective student, you were assigned a student, a current student, and in my case, her name was Peg Stone. I can remember that too. And she took me to her 11 o'clock class, which happened to be a philosophy class. And I sat through the class, and I didn't understand a word they were saying, but it sounded so cool. And the students were arguing with the professor. And at first I was sort of scandalized, but then I realized this is a good thing. These students are arguing with the professor about existence and me and all this stuff. And it was just so great. And then the thing that struck me was when class ended and Peg was taking me down to lunch, the students continued arguing on their way down to the dining hall, and then all the way through lunch about the issues they were talking about in class. And again, I didn't understand what they were saying, but it really sounded profound to me. And I thought, gee, imagine spending 4 years in an environment like this. It would be the most wonderful thing in the world. And I said, but they're never going to admit you. You're a hillbilly from West Virginia. But apparently there was a hillbilly quota.
I was going to say there's hillbilly quotas. They had to have a few of them, right? Exactly.
And my first year, I have to tell, it was one heck of a struggle. It was very difficult. And I didn't know whether I'd make it. And I didn't know whether I could stay. I mean, I was just so behind. But fortunately, wonderful professor realized that I was struggling. And he perceived in my participation in class discussions that I wasn't a complete dummy. And so he just made a project of me. And he got me up and going, taught me how to write essays, taught me how to sort of think analytically. And the next thing I knew, I was getting good grades and learning all this stuff. And I compiled a good record and off to Harvard Law School and then to Oxford for my doctorate in philosophy. And then I had this job at Princeton. So this is like one of these fairy stories,
Well, but a single act of kindness can change your life, as my wife always said. But I'll get to that later. I mean, you both talk about, obviously you're both gifted teachers and interested and dedicated teachers. And part of teaching is sort of passing along the gift that you've had, as you both point out. And clearly, I imagine what that professor did for you has impacted on how you deal with students. I'm sure.
I can tell you this, very often I realize it. I catch myself and I realize I'm lecturing the way James Kurth lectured. I'm interacting with the student the way James Kurth, that was his name, interacted with students. And I'll tell you, since I can never pay him back for what he did for me, this is my way of doing my best.
Exactly.
As a gesture in that direction. If I can do even a little bit of what he did for me, then at least I will have passed that gift that he gave me along.
Absolutely. In fact, this is I'm going off topic here, or at least I'm going ahead of myself here because we haven't got to Cornell yet. I still have 1 or 2 questions for you, George, but Robert, if you, in my teaching career, one of the perhaps most satisfying thing you can ever remember is if there's one student you can remember that you saved. Who would have just would have gone by the wayside, and you had an impact. Have each of you does that resonate with each of you? Yeah.
Oh, it's so true. So true. So
yeah,
great.
Yeah, absolutely. I've also learned, by the way, that it's important to suck up to your students too, because I taught at Yale for many years, actually around the same time Cornel was there in the divinity school. But um, later on, the first time I tried to write something for the Wall Street Journal, I wrote to the editor or someone had recommended me, and he said, "Did you teach at Yale the physics for poets class?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "I was in that class." And I said, what grade did you get?" He said, "I got an A," and then I knew I was in. Anyway, but before somehow that is what I want to go to even before Swarthmore. Your parents, my parents didn't go to college either. We were the first, my brother and I, the first kids to go to college, but something, you clearly were a dedicated intellect. You wanted to go to Swarthmore. You wanted to learn. You were fascinated by that class you went to. Where did you get that? I mean, were there books in the house? What was it that kindled your enthusiasm for intellectual ideas?
Well, I have to tell you, Dr. Krause, that when I arrived at
Please,
Swarthmore,
Lawrence, not Dr. Krause, or
Lawrence,
brother. You can call me brother if you want. I'm fine with that too.
Brother Lawrence. So let me tell you, Brother Lawrence, this is, I don't hold this against my parents in any way. The most wonderful parents. Cornell
Yeah.
knew them. They were just the greatest people in the world. But of course, they had no understanding of the intellectual life as something valuable for its own sake.
Mhm.
They didn't have an understanding of knowledge, and the pursuit of knowledge is intrinsically valuable. So what I was brought up with when they would talk about their ambition for their sons to go to college was, well, if you go to college, you'll advance in the world. You'll be able to go into a professional field, be a
Sure.
doctor, lawyer, accountant, something like that. You'll make more money. You'll have a good income, a more comfortable life.
Sure.
You'll have social status. Maybe you'll have influence. And those are all good things. And I continue to believe those are all good things.
Yeah.
But since that was what I was brought up with and had no conception of the intellectual life as something intrinsically valuable, for my first year, almost year and a half, I was proceeding on that basis, on that understanding of what college was for and what it was all about. Then I had, as Cornell knows, he's heard me tell the story many times, an epiphanal experience. That's the only way I can describe it. It's the closest thing to a religious experience I've ever had, a conversion experience I've ever had in my life, but it was intellectual. In an ordinary course in political theory, survey course, very good course, but a survey course beginning with Plato, going all the way up through John Rawls, who was the hottest thing in political philosophy in those days.
Mhm.
We were assigned Plato's dialogue called Gorgias.
Mhm.
And for those who are familiar with the dialogue, you'll know that one of the questions that it raises, Plato raises this through Socrates' interactions with the sophists, with his debating partners. One of the questions is, why are we doing this? Why are we debating? Why are we discussing? Why are we going back and forth with each other? Why are we engaging in this, to use the fancy word, dialectic? Why are we trying to get at things? What are we doing here? And of course, the sophists are interested in, well, power, money, prestige, status, training. They're paid very well to help the young men of Athens, from the best families in Athens, to be effective orators and persuasive, so that they can take their place and maintain their family's stature in public life, in public affairs. But through this process of argumentation, Plato brings us round to seeing something that I had not only never seen before, I'd never considered. And that is that the point is not status, prestige, money, standing, winning victories in the argument, showing off, that it's most fundamentally, no matter what other benefits it might confer instrumentally, most fundamentally, we need to get at the truth. We want the truth for its own sake, for its intrinsic enrichments of us as the kind of creatures we are, what his student Aristotle would describe as rational creatures, rational animals. Well, I mean, the light bulb really did go off or go on over my head, and suddenly I could see it. Suddenly I could see that I myself had been on the side of the sophists,
Yeah.
and I could see that they were in the wrong, and his arguments were compelling against them. And that led to both a frightening and exhilarating experience. And that was, I had to admit to myself, I taught through very little in my life. I had lots of opinions, but I was active in politics when I was in high school and all sorts of stuff. I had opinions about everything, but with only just very few exceptions, I'd not actually earned my opinion. I hadn't reasoned my way to my opinions. I hadn't done inquiry and thought. I just picked up the ambient, things from the ambient culture, or I believed things because I thought, well, this is what smart, sophisticated people
Yeah.
believe, and I want to be a smart, sophisticated, well-respected person, so I should believe these things too. So all of a sudden, everything was on the table. I had to re-examine all my beliefs. Couldn't take anything for granted. This is why I say it was both frightening and
It's
and
wonderful.
exhilarating.
It's those
It's
experiences.
frightening because we tend to identify ourselves with our convictions. Sometimes we wrap our emotions more or less tightly around our convictions, and so if you begin questioning everything, you don't know who you're going to be
Yeah.
when you go through the process. But it's also exhilarating because I felt for the first time, my gosh, I'm free. I'm a free man. I'm no longer the slave to the culture or to people's opinions of what sophisticated, smart people. I can believe whatever I think is actually true. And to go to the title of our book now, truth matters. It really does matter. Doesn't matter whether it gets you anywhere. It doesn't matter whether it gets you ahead. Even if it leaves you behind, even if it disadvantages you to believe the truth, it's still better to believe the truth. That old aphorism, it's better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. So it was transformative of my, and epiphanal, as I say, it was really transformative.
There's a lot of pedagogy that says that the only real learning you do is when you confront your own misconceptions, and that you remember. The first time you confront your own misconceptions, you really remember it. Otherwise, you sort of sometimes, things go in one ear and out the other. But when you suddenly realize that you're wrong, in fact, even in science museums, it's exhilarating in a way. For many people, it's terrifying, but it's exhilarating. It's that aha experience. Suddenly, see the world in a new way. And I've often said that I hope that every student once in their life has something that they profoundly believe to be true at the very core of their being, be shown to be wrong, because that's really the experience we want them to have. And I know you guys talk a lot about that, but so I don't want to go too much further, but I do want to ask you why you must have been a good student, because otherwise you wouldn't have gone to Swarthmore. You must have been good enough to make the cut. So you must have been interested in school and doing well when you were younger. So did you read a lot when you were younger? Did you read? No?
I wasn't a great reader. I have to admit. And I was a good student, but not a great student. I wasn't my class valedictorian in high school or anything.
That's wonderful. I've always loved to point that out, because a lot of people get discouraged because they say, I didn't want to go in the subject because I wasn't the best person. And then I know so many people, Nobel Prize winners and other people who, weren't the best in their class, and it doesn't matter.
Well, it was amazing because I was not the winner of all the awards and so forth when I was in high school, but when I graduated from college, I was given the award for the outstanding graduating man, and I had, Phi Beta Kappa. It was unimaginable to me when I entered Swarthmore, and especially because it was so hard, and I was struggling so much, and all these kids were so much smarter than anybody I ever met before. So again, I have to, thank Professor Kurth and my other wonderful professors who brought
because
me
you
along.
struggled that you got more out of it, I guess. But anyway, we'll have time for the rest of your book, but hold on. Two last things. One, you decided that just having the JD and fulfilling your mother's expectation of being a lawyer wasn't good enough, and you wanted to decide, and you went to Master's of Divinity and then PhD in philosophy. You just didn't want to be a lawyer?
Well, no, let me tell you about that. So, basically, that experience with Plato, turned me on to philosophy. Now, remember, it had been a philosophy course that I had attended, a philosophy class that I attended on that first day as a visitor.
I know,
I
it's
didn't
poetic.
understand the thing. It just sounded really cool. So it was that experience with Plato, reading the Gorgias, that turned me on to philosophy. And pretty soon I realized that while I was interested in many dimensions of philosophy, what we today call philosophy of mind, aesthetics, what I was most logic, what I was most interested in were the philosophy of law and moral and political philosophy. And I got especially interested through another professor in medieval thinkers, in the Muslim and Jewish and Christian medieval thinkers, people like Averroes, Maimonides, Aquinas, exactly. And so I did, apply to law school, but I also wanted to study more medieval philosophy. And I figured out that although ordinarily you'd have to get into a PhD program, and Harvard doesn't have terminal master's programs in this area, and most universities in the United States don't. I figured out that there was a degree program in the divinity school that I could use to take courses in medieval
Master's in
philosophy.
Divinity is very much like a BA for, a general BA for people who want to do graduate
Yeah,
work. I have a friend of mine who's
yeah.
doing
My
that at
degree was
Harvard
called
too.
an MTS, a Master of
Yeah, you
Theological
could just
Studies.
read the kind of stuff you want.
And I was reading the kind of stuff I wanted. It also made law school more palatable because, of course, when you go to law school, if you're thinking you're going to study philosophy, you're wrong. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
you're studying a lot of stuff that was to me pretty boring, but I could keep my mind alert by also doing these courses in medieval philosophy and other philosophical subjects. But I realized fairly soon that I really wanted to pursue an academic career. Now, to do the work I most wanted to do in philosophy of law, especially in the tradition of philosophy of law that I was interested in, it's come to be known as the analytic tradition, the tradition of analytic jurisprudence, analytical jurisprudence. To do it at the best place in the world, which was Oxford University, you needed to have a first law degree. Now, that's easy for British students and for students in some other countries because you can get a first law degree as a bachelor's.
Yeah, exactly. You go directly to law school. Yeah.
In the United States, we don't do that. We don't have undergraduate degrees in law. So to qualify for admission to the DPhil program, the Doctor of Philosophy program in philosophy of law at Oxford, I needed a first law degree. So by getting that law degree at Harvard, I would fulfill that requirement, which indeed I did. And then I went on to the program at Oxford, where I did my DPhil in philosophy of law. But in the meantime, to make money in the summers when I was in law school, I worked for big law firms and in Boston. And darn if I didn't find it really interesting. And in an area that I never would have imagined I would find interesting. I was working for three major law firms, first summer after first year, summer after second year, and then as a young lawyer after I graduated. Three major Boston law firms, and in each case working in the commercial and industrial real estate market, the real estate department. Now, that sounds really boring when you don't know anything about commercial and industrial real estate. When you do know something about it, it turns out to have all sorts of interesting dimensions. So I hesitated just a moment. I thought about maybe I will make my career as a practicing lawyer, but I'm glad that in the end I decided not to do that. Now I went ahead and of course I had my law degree and I got myself admitted to the bar in New Jersey and in Pennsylvania and the appellate courts and Supreme Court of the United States and so forth. And I've continued as of counsel to a law firm to practice part-time appellate litigation, whatever I can do consistently with fulfilling my obligations at Princeton. So I've got a hand in there, but I'm very glad that I decided that I didn't get deflected and I decided to carry on with an academic career. It's been a beautiful, fulfilling, wonderful career. And it's enabled me to teach courses with my beloved brother, Cornel West.
Exactly. You guys, you've been able to pay that gift forward.
Academic career.
It is it's a great privilege. Not people realize, I mean, it's a true privilege and it's a privilege. And also what I've realized afterwards, it's kind of a safe job too, even though you're supposed to be intellectually risky. It's a very safe job to be in academia too, but it's a great privilege to be able to do what you want. And there aren't many jobs where you can. And in academia, unfortunately, more and more you have less freedom to do what you want, but we'll get there.
Talk about that.
And one of my great concerns. And the very last one line answer to this question, and then I want to go to Cornel. I have to ask everyone this. Why and it's one of the glaring things that we'll talk about in both of your backgrounds is no science. And so and did science ever interest you?
No, not until I had to learn it because it became very highly relevant to what I was doing. And I'll tell you how that happened. So I slept through biology in high school. Physics are a little more interesting, but I basically slept through
a lot more interesting, but okay, we won't go there.
So then in the 1990s, I served on the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. And then in the early 2000s, with the new administration, President Bush, I was appointed to the President's Council on Bioethics. And there we have all these very important issues on which you actually had to know the biology. And, here again, once you actually begin learning something, I only did it because I had to figure out like where babies come from and, how human life began and all this stuff. Well, lo and behold, it turns out to be fascinating. And really, so all of a sudden I found myself, I'm reading through these texts in human embryology and developmental biology and going into the literature and having opportunities to discuss these things with some of the world's greatest
Yeah, sure.
authorities on human embryology, teratology, and so forth. So that's how I ended up learning something about
Learning
science,
so
and also figuring out why people who are so dedicated to science are so dedicated. It really is interesting.
yeah, well, absolutely. But I hit the point that sometimes there's a right time to learn things, and so when you don't know why you're studying something, it's sometimes you just goes in one ear out the other again, and
Well,
then that's when there's a reason, and it also points out something that I'm sure both of you have found in your careers. Um, I was a professor of physics and astronomy for many, many years. I never took an astronomy class in my life, and before that, and in physics, I often say I learned much more physics after my PhD than before. The idea being a lifelong learner, the fact that it doesn't end, and you learn even as a faculty member, you learn much more if you're reasonable and good throughout life. And I think one of the things we want, you talk about teaching a lot in your book, and you talk, and we'll get there, I hope. Uh, the kind of things you want to imbue with kids. But one of them, I think that you don't discuss, but I think what is really important is how to teach them to be lifelong learners, to that it doesn't end at college, that to
that's
keep asking the questions, to keep learning. Anyway, we'll get there, but I want to get to Cornell. He's been so patient and smiling and
This has
happy over
been
there.
a
And
wonderful,
and
wonderful conversation.
well, it
Thank
yes, and I'm sure it's just part of what's going to be continuing to be a wonderful conversation that way. Um, you now it seemed to me between the two of you, your parents were more professional in
That's
right.
true.
Your mother was a teacher and a principal, right?
That's
And
exactly
father
right.
was a
a
contractor for
wonderful lady, and a
a wonderful
wonderful
lady. It's
lady.
great that you know
I
each
had
other.
the blessing to know her,
Yeah,
Yeah,
no,
and
she
Irene West.
she loved Brother Robbie too.
there's a school named after her, isn't there? She must have been a great
That's
teacher.
true, Brother
Right?
Lawrence.
I did my
Absolutely.
research.
Irene B. West Elementary School right there in El Grosso, California, right
Wowie, it
outside of
must be a
Sacramento.
great
That's a
privilege to go
beautiful
there.
thing. It's a beautiful thing.
So you look, I mean, you are also clearly, and like Robert, but clearly, I mean, a lifelong intellectual, someone fascinated by ideas and many other things. Did you did that come from your mother or father, or where did that come from in when you were really young?
Well, I tell you now, you know, brother, any quest for origins has its mystery sitting
Yeah,
at
of
the
course. That's why. That's the greatest mystery of all. That's why I do it.
right. Why is that? Something rather than nothing. What is
Yeah.
the origin of melody and the origin of the universe? All of these origin questions, which are indispensable questions, but in the end, there's always a sense of mystery given our finitude. And
Hmm.
the origins of my own love of learning is a difficult thing. Mom would read poetry to us all the time. There's no
Ah.
doubt about that. And I learned a lot in Sunday school and vacation Bible school. You can imagine one of the great works of world poetry is the book of Job. Now, granted, I wasn't reading it in Hebrew, it was the King James, but the King James Version was still poetic.
Yeah.
Yeah, they flattened it out recently, but the King James Version has an elective affinity to Shakespearean language. But it's hard to know exactly where it comes from, though. They had a bookmobile way out where we grew up on the
Ah,
chocolate side of something.
bookmobiles. I love them. They were such great
And I
gifts.
loved
Me
those books,
too.
but I would
So,
read, I read every book in the bookmobile.
I wouldn't
And
surprise me. I mean,
that's
yeah, I mean,
Cornell.
yeah,
well, it wasn't that big a bookmobile.
yeah.
That's true. But I emerged really with two heroes. And even when I was all through undergrad and grad, I'd always have two pictures on my wall. I'd have Malcolm X and Albert Einstein. Those were the
Oh,
two figures. I read Einstein. In fact, I picked up playing the piano in part because of his piano, the violin,
the violin. I was going to say.
because of
I
his
hope you're a
violin.
better violin player than he was. That's right.
Well, no. I played for a number of years, but I was just so glad to be part of his
Mhm.
company.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
young person playing the violin. I did play first violin for a good while, and went on to Harvard and made some money playing alpha chamber violin just to get me through
So
alongside.
you've always been musical. You've always been musical as well.
Well, no, not really. I love music. It saturates my soul, but I was
Yeah,
never really a musician other than those years playing the violin,
yeah. I see.
definitely. But it was Kierkegaard and Einstein
Really?
that hit me hard at the bookmobile. And then there in college, I'd have the Malcolm X picture and Einstein right next
Well,
to.
now I'm going to jump ahead. I mean, I want to get to the other things you did and why you chose to do what you did. But once again, now I'm going to ask you that question because I meet people I really admire intellectually. I always wonder how come they didn't become physicists. And so let me ask you the question: what if Einstein was up on the wall, how come he didn't become a physicist?
Well, because and I know Brother Robbie knows that Albert Einstein was so much more than a physicist, even
Yes, he
though he
was.
was a physicist, right?
Yeah,
He was the
yeah,
one that said imagination was much more important than knowledge. He was
absolutely.
the one that had a sense of fallibility, but a fundamental commitment to truth. I was just reading the other night his great correspondence with Sigmund Freud. Remember, Einstein is asked
Yeah.
to choose anybody in the world to
Hmm.
have a dialogue with. He chooses Freud. It's
Yeah.
1931. Let's talk about war. And what's
Yeah.
the first thing he says in the letter to Freud? I love your fundamental commitment, your pursuit of truth.
Oh, well, there you go.
It doesn't get too much better than that.
Yeah.
This dialogue with Tagore. He ends up
And
saying, well,
his
I'm
other
more religious than you are,
y-
Tagore, because I have a sense of the invisibility of things, and you only go with what is visible. Ooh, and I see
yeah,
that.
yeah.
That's
He did it. He
Einstein.
was a little woo woo at times. It's true.
No,
I guess.
well, he's got but he had a spinozistic sensibility, and
Yeah,
therefore
I know.
that's
Of course he's. I'm just poking you a
absolutely,
little bit there. But
absolutely.
just again as an aside, his letters are great. I don't know if you ever read his letter to Madame Curie, which is if you ever wanted to
No, I
hear
never
about
read that.
intellectual courage.
Yes.
It's a really fascinating one because we'll get to wokeness and other things maybe. I mean, sometime in hour 8 of this we'll get to that. But it's a wonderful letter to Madame Curie because she was vilified because she had a relationship and various things and Einstein basically wrote her an incredible letter to be intellectually brave and not care what people think. It's a great. I'll
I
find it.
want to.
I'll
I want
you'll
to
give me
see.
your email afterwards and I'll send you the email because
No, I can look that
I
up.
often look at it because it's really inspiring how
Yeah,
and
yeah.
also that he reached out to help someone who was being vilified, which is a true act of courage. And I know how many people virtue signal and don't even reach out to people who are, for one reason or another, vilified in the modern world. And just
Oh,
reaching out to someone like that is an act of courage.
well, you remember he opened his door to Paul Robeson and W.B. Du Bois when they were
Y-
basically banned, taking passports taken away, and so
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
no, no,
So that's
Einstein,
a real act of courage. Yeah. Anyway.
he's a towering. It's what Lionel Trilling once called a figure rather than just an intellectual,
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Certainly.
and
Absolutely.
that's a rare thing.
It's
But
rare. It's a
also,
rare thing.
even in my education, though, brother, it's also true that from the very beginning, I was always concerned about the quest for truth as it related to, be it the new physics of Descartes or the relativity theory of Einstein. That's why Whitehead has always meant so much to me.
Yeah. In fact, and maybe why you guys called your course named him after Whitehead's. By the
Absolutely.
way, I have to ask again. It's later on the question. I didn't know this. The title of the course is Adventures of Ideas.
Here it is right
Adventure
here,
of
my
Ideas.
brother.
There it is. That's his book. And you said to me, you said in not to me, but I keep feeling like you were talking to me when you're writing the book. But you're talking to Robert. But uh, that I did not know this. That originally the Society of Fellows that was required reading.
That's exactly right.
And I was in the Society of Fellows, and it wasn't required reading by me. I was probably one
But
of many lack
you see how
gaps in
things
my.
had begun, a little decline had set in,
Yeah,
Everything
it's
brother.
was
just the
going
decline.
down.
This is
No, the minute they
1930.
admitted, look, it was very
No,
clear. The minute they
I'm
admitted
just
me to the
kidding.
Society of Fellows, it started to go into decline. In any
Just,
case,
but you know who talks about this is Harry Levin. And Harry Levin came in that first wave. And
yeah,
and his godfather was Whitehead, of course.
yeah,
And he
yeah,
was the dissertation advisor for Edward Said, actually, too. It's a dissertation on Joseph Conrad. But Levin talks about this in his essay. And each one of those students had to read that and have discussions about it. And by the time you got in, or of course, you had
yeah,
Thomas Kuhn and Quine and
yeah, exactly.
Cabell
Yeah,
and
yeah,
Prippy.
yeah. Quine was there when I was in, and
So many of my teachers were Society of Fellow people.
yeah, no, it's you weren't in the Society of Fellows. You would have been a
No,
great
no, no,
candidate.
no,
Okay,
no, no, no,
but
no. I was never
it's
part.
funny how we kind of overlap. This is also another first because the three of us are almost the same age,
Ooh,
within 6 months of each other, which is not so we're the same whatever.
wow.
We have a certain sensibility that we share, but we also have come. We have I have been close to you probably without ever knowing it. And when I was in the Society of Fellows, you used to get free meals, and I ate at the law school, which was right next to the physics department every day to get my free meals there. So you were probably there studying. And Cornell, when you were in the indie school at Yale, I was up Science Hill, so we've been close to each other.
Oh, would you say
Um,
you overlap with Saul Kripke?
uh, uh, no, I didn't overlap with Saul Kripke. No,
Saul's a bit older.
yeah, a little bit older.
Yeah.
Saul's a little bit older though.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did overlap with is a I don't know, an intellectual combatant of yours, but only 1 year. Leon was.
Well, the Leon, yes, yes. Well,
Yeah, he was,
Leon
but
comes out of
he
Berlin.
criticized everyone, so you weren't unique in that regard.
He comes out of Berlin and Trilling at the same time.
Yeah.
In
Well, and I
terms of
think
his
because I've
formative
talked to
influence.
Leon since then, but I think because I was a physicist and therefore a sort of a peasant, we never talked much. Um,
Oh,
but now we do. Anyway,
missed opportunity,
uh,
missed opportunity.
yeah, well, yeah, there's a lot of missed opportunities. You find out later in life. Youth is wasted on the young.
On
But
the young, yeah. So is education, by the way,
yeah,
Will.
exactly. Your grandfather was a pastor, so that did you get your religion through him?
No. It was through mom and dad because he's in
Mom and dad.
Tulsa, Oklahoma. I'm in Sacramento, California. Yeah.
Yeah,
But
but he
that's
was
my
more
father's father, Reverend
okay.
C. Ella West, Metropolitan Baptist Church. Absolutely.
Now you must have been a good student because you got into Harvard. You were a student body president, which usually means this. It surprises me because I mean I'm obviously I know of you and I know a lot about you, but this is the first time we've actually ever had to chat, and I'm so excited about it. But normally the student body president is kind of the regular guy. And if I had to pick someone who
Brother
wasn't
Cornell,
a
not a
regular
regular guy.
guy, that would be you. And so I was
You
wondering,
very
did you
kind.
change much or what happened?
You very kind. No. I'm the same, brother. I've always been in that sense, though. But yeah, I graduated 4.0 straight A's and student body president and set
You were
records
just
in the 2 mile as an
Yeah, there
athlete.
you go. So you were the first perfect candidate for Harvard, and then maybe not a Rhodes Scholarship. But anyway, you went to, but when you, oh, I want to know why you chose Near Eastern languages at Harvard. Why did you choose that?
Well, what happened was my beloved chairman, who was John Rawls, that
Oh, okay.
I went in his office when I decided to graduate in 3 years rather than four. And I was actually majoring in philosophy, but you had to take a colloquium in junior year and senior year. And I asked whether I could take the colloquium the same year, the junior and senior colloquium. He said, absolutely not, Cornell. He said, we would love to make an exception, but you can't. I said, but I'm majoring in philosophy. I've got to graduate in 3 years because I'm running out of money. My parents have daughters going to college and so forth. And I went back to my dorm and I discovered I'd taken all these courses in Near Eastern languages and literature with no plan whatsoever to major in Near Eastern language and literature. So I had all these years in Hebrew, Aramaic, Mesopotamian thought with the great Thorgerd Jacobson and the great biblical scholars and so forth. And so I just decided, well, let me major in it. But I wasn't a real major because my real major was in philosophy. So I went and talked to Quine and Nelson Goodman and the others, and of course the Hillary Putnam, who continue to mean the world to me. And I said, can I still go to graduate school in philosophy if I major in Near Eastern language and literature? He said, sure.
Sure, you can. Yeah.
Now, the reason why I had taken all those languages was I wanted to read the biblical text in the original language. So I took Greek, I took Koine and classical Greek, and I took Hebrew.
And was that because of your interest in religion? Then I was wondering. I mean, you obviously took these classes that must have interested you, and it was because you had a deep interest in the Bible. And
absolutely, I want to get at what was the formation of these texts and how you read these things in the original language rather than depend on the English. And I'm so glad I did. It was just, it was
I mean, I'm so glad you did too, because you interspersed with everything you write and say are these wonderful allusions and quotes and knowledge of that. And I find it incredibly inspiring. It's really, really great.
Oh, that's very kind of you.
Well, it's true. Okay, well let's now move toward, this is great. I've learned a little bit about each of you, and it's important. I also think it's fascinating because you guys do a lot of talks about other things, but I think it's interesting for people, to learn a little bit more about you and how you got to where you got to. And I think it's good for young people to learn this because it's often there's a country music song that said, "The long and winding road that brought me straight to you," and but it's so often, it's funny to see where people end up, and see that it isn't always just a linear trajectory, and I think it's important for young people to realize that. I often tell young people, in fact, as Robert, I often say, when they ask where they want to go to school, I said, choose a place first you want to live, and secondly, the kind of place that it doesn't matter. You can get a good education anywhere, or a bad education anywhere. But choose one where your peers are people who are interested, and they're gonna learn from them.
Sure.
And
That's
and
true.
often and choose a place where, unless you're absolutely certain what you want to do in life, and there's a few people who are, uh, choose a place where there may be options. You may discover something you had no idea you were interested in. And anyway, I don't like to give advice too much, but that's when young people ask me, that's what I say.
That's good advice.
That's wise.
The
Well,
other piece
I
of advice
like
along those lines that I always give students, give my own children, is
mhm,
look for the truly great professors. Pay less attention to the course descriptions or whether you happen to be interested in the subject matter. Learn from the people who can teach you how to think. You can almost apprentice
yeah,
your mind to them. So if the great scholar happens to be somebody who does Chaucer, and you're not especially interested in the English literature or in Chaucer,
doesn't matter.
nevertheless, take that guy's class. Just find out who the best professors are and study with them. Learn
Great,
from them
great,
how to
great point.
learn, how to think.
Yeah, absolutely. Great point. And you probably don't know in advance. And again, to point it out, I mean, uh, well, Swarthmore is a well-known school. I went to a school in Canada. I grew up in Canada, and then I went to did my PhD at MIT. And I tell kids, even at an unknown school, you can have great teachers, and you don't have to go to Harvard or wherever. And so it's really important to know that you can find those great teachers, and not only that, as you all talk about, and we all know as professors, there's nothing better if you're a teacher than having a great student. And so it just is inspiring. And if you're interested, and um, and I'm sad to say that, you talk about how the kids, I mean, obviously the kids fight to get in your course. And so it's a very self-selecting group. But in general, it's so refreshing to meet students who are actually interested and aren't there to get just a degree to get a job.
Oh yeah, it's a
oh,
real problem
absolutely.
today. The pre-professionalism and just the excessive, absolutely excessive focus on ambition. Ambition is a good thing. No one's saying
Yeah.
don't be ambitious, but gosh, if that replaces, if it overwhelms the desire for knowledge, the desire to grow intellectually, then you've just wasted your parents' money and your
Yeah,
time.
yeah, yeah. It's about too many kids nowadays, it seems to me, just sort of it's 4 years rite of passage. They don't know why they're
Yeah.
there. In fact, I should ask you this. Boy, we're going on to all different tangents, but I mean, as a kid, I mean, for me, education was always important. I always knew I wanted to go to college and then later on be a professor. But and ideas were always fascinating to me across the spectrum. Um, but now where was I going to go there? My mind is just gone. Uh, uh, well. Anyway, I was going to say
Yeah.
something profound, but it's okay. Um,
But I'll say this though, brother, that
yeah,
you see when we were coming along, this is not the Neolithic age or anything,
yeah,
but just a few decades ago, we didn't have brands, we didn't have market strategies for careers,
hmm
we didn't have these teleological ends and aims that somehow we had to have. We reduced our ambition down to just money making, because ambition can be a beautiful thing when it
yeah,
has a deep sense of vocation to it.
yeah,
Yeah, well,
So if
that's
you
it.
want to be the greatest poet, like Keats or Shelley or
yeah,
whoever, that takes tremendous ambition.
yeah,
But it's not ambition that's flattened out, market driven. And so you reduce causes to brands and you reduce vocation to just professions. And you reduce greatness to just worldly success. That is a dumbing down that is unbelievably devastating. And
yeah.
that's
You, in
what
fact,
we've seen.
you talk about it in the book, and by the way, I did remember you reminded me of the point, which was I wrote one of my books. I spent a lot of time in Switzerland and in Zurich, and there in Switzerland, they stream kids, so only about 10 to 15% of kids go to college. It's not as if you can't. Um, and it first shocked me because my first thought, was everyone should go to college. Everyone should have. a college education. And then I must admit, my mind I think has evolved on that. That I think obviously everyone should have the opportunity to go to college. Uh, but I think I see a lot of kids who are in college who are just not ready. They have no idea why they're there, and so I think it's maybe not for everyone right away, and it's fine to go back. But I think for a lot of people, it is just 4 years in there for a credential, and you wonder whether they are wasting their parents' money and maybe society's time. It was a shock to me to think that maybe college isn't for everyone. I don't know if you, what do you
The
guys think?
credentialism is a real problem, and this is why I love the way Cornell begins our courses together. So that we can only take a very
Yeah,
tiny fraction of the students who apply because we want to keep a seminar format where you can
yeah,
really engage issues. We don't want to get up there and lecture
yeah.
at people.
And I think you said 18 or 19. That was about mine
Yeah,
when I
that's the
taught
most we can
seminars.
do. I mean, if we let the 800 kids in who want to
Yeah,
get in,
there's no
especially two
discussion.
hams like us, we'd be up there
Yeah, yeah,
pontificating.
yeah, yeah, that's right.
Uh,
The students
but
would
the,
love it, but it wouldn't be the education you want to give them. That's right.
But they come whatever they come in with. They may come in with the credentialist
Mm,
attitude. They want to get the Princeton degree or the
mm,
Harvard
mm.
degree, and then up to Goldman Sachs, and then
Yeah,
onto this
yeah.
and that. So Cornell opens by saying, "Let's think about why we're here. Why we're here. Since what we're here to do is to learn how to die." Now that, if your goal is
That's a
Goldman
great.
Sachs, you came to Princeton, you're going to go to Goldman Sachs. And your brother Cornell said, your professor said, you're here to learn how to
Learn how to
die.
die.
But, pretty soon they understand that you're
Mhm.
here to learn how to die so that you can learn how to live.
How to live, because
You
you
can
only have the one.
prioritize your value.
Unlike you
Now
guys,
we're
I've
going to get into the deep stuff.
yeah,
Now we're going to get into Plato. Now we're going to get into the meaning of life stuff. Now we're going to get into the big, deep, questions of human nature, the human good, human dignity, human destiny. This is a serious business, in other words. So
absolutely.
I don't know if getting an A in our class is going to help you to get into Harvard Law School. I don't know if our recommendation is going to help you to go to Morgan Stanley.
Oh, sure
But you're
will.
going to learn how to die in this
Yeah,
class.
now
That's
learn
what
how to
we're
die.
about.
That's a really, and you know what? This actually, it's a good segue finally to what I might want to talk because uh, unlike you guys, you only get one crack and life that's what for me like because there is no afterlife, sorry. The makes life for me so much more special. You got this one chance. Don't blow it. You make every moment count. Make every second worthwhile because you have one chance here. And I know you guys agree with me in spite of the fact that you think you'll be hanging out there shooting the breeze for an eternity afterwards. But anyway, um, but actually, that does make a segue because your book. Look, the book "Truth Matters" is a dialogue on fruitful disagreement and aid division, and I want to cover a whole bunch. There it is. I was going to do the promo for you, but look, we'll talk about a lot of the ideas. I have no agenda here because the point is to have the kind of discussion that your book's all about because it's so important to be able to have respectful, enjoyable, joyful, as Cornell would say, conversations where you don't agree about topics that may be difficult to talk about, and I want to address them. So there's a lot of things I have here. We won't get to all of them, but I really just want to have that kind of dialogue. Except it won't be a dialogue; it'll be a trialogue. And and I do want to point out that that's something that it hadn't hit me till I thought about doing this. A lot of people might say, and you talk about, you're kind of antipodes, right? Um, uh, at least on paper, Robert George might look like this sort of classical conservative Catholic, and and Cornell looks like the sort of progressive jazz rebel, and that's fine. But you're not you're actually just 2 points on that sphere because you really, when I think about it, you have so many compared to me, you have so many more similarities than differences. Both Christian, yeah, different denominations, but to me, that's just in the noise. Um, Although I know there are profound
It, it,
differences, and
it
we'll
can
get to
make
there.
a difference, my
Yeah,
brother. It
I
can
know,
make
I
a
know, I know it does, and we'll get to that.
But there's also truth in what you're saying, Lawrence.
but
You
Yeah,
know,
there's a
and you're
lot of
both
it's
you're both of
it's
a
in the detail. I mean,
humanistic.
there's no question that part of the bond between Cornell and me, part of that foundational bond, is the shared
Oh, and
Christian
we'll get
faith,
there.
and that
Absolutely.
relativizes the differences, between Catholic, Baptist,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
Wisconsin, or even Jewish Christian.
yeah,
I
absolutely.
we
And
talked
we'll
about your brother Michael when he was here
yeah,
a very distinguished law professor, legal scholar, and he was here for a year in the Madison program, very devout, observant Jew. And
Absolutely.
Michael and I, no question about it, had a bond that
Because
was
you're
in
because of
part founded on that shared faith, that
absolutely.
common
And so
bond
you've
that
got that.
faith and Jews and Christians share.
You've got your humanistic, basically you're both humanists in different ways. And so you've got that
Yeah.
shared thing. And and uh and so if I had to pick of someone who in some sense is more of the, and I have to pose to you guys, it's me, right?
There you
Because
are.
first of all, I'm a scientist. I mean, I happen to love writing and reading and books and of all sorts, but my fundamental sensibilities are those of a scientist. I'm an atheist. I won't say a devout atheist, but and I'm a Jew, right? And so and and I kind of am also a different. I grew up in Canada, which makes me automatically, no matter what my politics are, they're to the left of most Americans. Um,
Oh,
and but I'm also thought of as a now called a right-wing pundit because I write about my complaints about modern academia and freedom of speech and cancel culture. And when I write in the Wall Street Journal, I'm a right-wing pundit. We are now kind of there's no antipose. We're kind of different parts of the sphere. And I think it'll be fun to have that dialogue because we'll have some disagreements that you guys wouldn't have that we three can have. And,
although on that last one, Lawrence,
uh-huh.
on the defense of free speech and the importance of open inquiry and of truth-seeking,
Yeah.
there we're all three
We're all three,
on
of
on
course.
the
I mean,
same ground. Yeah, and I mean to this day, I'm still kind of dumbstruck, flabbergasted at how uh, free speech came to be a right-wing cause.
I
Now, when I
know
was a
it's
kid,
incredible. Suddenly I discovered
when
I
I
was
was a
right-wing
kid,
because of
it
the
was a
same thing
left,
I believed
yeah,
all
it
my
was a
life.
left-wing cause. It was a left-wing cause, and it was the at least one of the rare respects in which even after my conversion to conservatism, I remained a left-winger on free speech. But now that makes you a right-winger.
Yeah, and I'm a left-winger in other ways, but I be converted to the right wing because I defend free speech and because I criticize I criticize a lot of the last administration because of that, because of issues of wokeness and identity culture that I thought were hurting the country as well as academia. And
Well, that you mentioned that word identity and
yeah,
identitarianism.
yeah, you
I'll
talk
tell you
about it.
something. I think you're on board with Cornell and me on there. We disagree about a lot of other things,
Mm.
but Cornell and I are fundamentally, and this book is fundamentally
Oh,
anti-tribal.
oh,
You know,
yes,
we,
after
we
you
just
talk
think that
about it
tribal, we
explicitly.
understand human beings made the way we are with the
Mm.
nature we have. We're naturally tribal. We got that. We got that. And we don't think that, desiring to be in communities, including communities integrated around shared beliefs, that's not bad in itself. In
Yeah,
fact,
yeah.
it's a good thing and makes possible
Humans
some
need it at
wonderful
some
things.
level. Yeah.
But what we mean by tribalism, when we reject tribalism, is the idea of, my country right or wrong, or that kind of thing, that we will cast truth aside in order to remain in good standing in the tribe. Neither one of us is going to do that. And both of us have, felt the consequences of
Yeah.
saying to
But,
people in our so-called tribe,
but I
we
think
can't go on. We
what
can't
one
go
of the
along with it.
well, one of the crucial messages I think of the text is that dogmatism is ideologically and theologically and politically promiscuous. So
Mhm.
that if certain dogmatists are in place and abusing power, they can be right wing, they could be centrist, they could be leftist. You're trying to be Socratic and prophetic, which means you're trying to be consistent in any form of dogmatism that is blinding willfully or not willfully any serious pursuit of truth, but not just truth. And here I do think, when Whitehead said that music, mathematics, metaphysics, those three are the three great achievements. You see, then when you see a scientist, that's secondary now because it's the math and the music. What is the conception of science without symmetry? But that's an aesthetic ideal. What is the
Mhm.
conception of science without some coherence and harmony? Those are aesthetic ideals, you see. So that even when one says I'm a scientist, it really means I am a certain humanist of a sort that puts a premium on quantitative analysis
Oh, not
and
just
math.
quantitative. And I agree with everything you said, but I think one of the things you often attribute to Christianity or Catholicism, I mean, and we'll get to it.
I'm amazed in the book how you talk about, and it's really important to question yourself, to be able to have dialogues with others so that you can learn you're wrong.
That's right.
And that's so important. And you emphasize so much. But I kept writing science, 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 because that's what science is all about. Science is, first of all, a social. You don't do it alone.
That's
And
right.
it's based on a dialectic. It's based on throwing your ideas out and being willing to have them being torn down. And it is a, well, it's jumping ahead. You talked about dogmatism. And I think, Robert, somewhere in the book, you say, the big thing is you criticize other people's ideas, and that's great, and open up, but then you become dogmatic in your own. And I think what I love about science is it recognizes that we're all that way. We're all flawed, and it provides us a set of tools to overcome that. So science, the
Oh, yes.
process of science is based on saying scientists are human, and therefore they're flawed, they're
That's right.
biased, they're all, all of the things that humans are, and we're going to provide you tools that overcome that. So
Well,
yeah, if you're a scientist, you want to
it never,
believe, but other people will show you that you're not, that you're
but
wrong. Sorry.
you never overcome it. I mean, you can be a person when it comes to science. So you got a community over time that's involved in putting forward arguments and adducing evidence, seeing what kind of logical, valid conclusions you can reach. But you never overcome it because you're perennially in that process.
Yeah, that's right. You never.
It's Kuhnian in that sense of acknowledging that you're going to have frameworks and paradigms that are dominant, and those
Yeah,
paradigms have their own dogmatism.
yeah. Well, I don't. I think Kuhn is a little, in my opinion, out of date in that regard. I think you're right that what science, in fact, hey, I'm going to get to the point where you talk about later what truth is, but it's funny how I'm just going way over the where I was going to do later, but the nice thing about science is there is no such thing as scientific truth. There's only scientific falsehood. And it's really what you guys are saying, that science can never prove something to be true. It can have a theory that's correct, but it can always be subsumed by something deeper. Uh, and you never have a complete view of the truth, which is something I know that Cornell, in your own way, and Robert Yoth, I mean, you all emphasize this, even when you talk about the traditional philosophers recognizing this, that we never have a complete view of truth. But science codifies that. We even have a quantitative way of understanding it that will always, you always can have an experiment around the corner that's going to show that you have to revise what you thought was right. It works. And let me just say, what works will always be true. So Newton, I drop a ball, a million years from now, whenever whatever theory of quantum gravity or whatever we have, if we're around, it's going to be a totally different fundamental picture of the world, but the ball will still fall and it'll still be described by Newton's laws. So that's the other thing people don't realize, is that scientific revolutions aren't like human revolutions, although even human revolutions don't do away with everything that went before, as you know. They subsume it. So what's true before is always incorporated within the new thing, but it's never complete. And so when you guys talk about that, I keep again saying science, science, science.
Well, I agree with most of what you just said there, but everything that sounds right to me about what you've said about science, the same can be said for philosophy. Going all the way back to the very beginning, our father, Socrates, is, testing every view he holds. And in fact, he's formally denying that he knows anything, except that he doesn't know anything. The one truth he'll affirm is that he doesn't know anything.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, I don't think we're meant to take him literally about that. He does know some things.
Yeah,
but nothing is immunized from critique, from challenge. And I think the way I'd sum it up is not that, there's no truth in science. I'd rather say science understands, just as philosophy, when it's sound and when it doesn't become dogmatism, understands that all truth is revisable. It's revisability. And that's connected to our fallibility, which means that we never have a genuine interest in shutting down critique, challenge, immunizing our beliefs against critique or challenge. We've always got to be open in view of the fact, the knowledge that we do have, that our knowledge is partial at best and prone to error.
And not only partial and prone to error, absolutely. That I was going to paraphrase Cornell later on. I have some notes where he said it in a different way. Ultimately, that we have to also realize that the easiest person to fool is yourself.
Oh, absolutely.
And therefore, we have to take special care to realize when something seems special or wonderful to us, we have to be asking ourselves, is there a reason that it does? Or am I just fooling myself?
That's
And
right.
that's probably the hardest part about being a scientist in a way. I've seen experimentalists who've been deluded because, if you're doing an experiment, you always get some weird result. It's just statistics, right? And, something weird happens. And the real problem is when the scientist says, ooh, there's something significant there without asking the question, is it just an accident? And
Well,
and so
that's important.
go on, sorry.
Important. But
The danger that Cornell has pointed to so often, and here he's channeling Hayek, is the danger of science falling into scientism.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And supposing that the only truth is truth that can be ascertained by the methodologies of the natural sciences. There are methodologies that are appropriate to the natural sciences that are not appropriate to the study of literature, to the examination of some philosophical questions. That there are things that when your subject matter is empirical, then there are certain methods that apply. If they're interpretative, different methods apply.
Well, yes and no. That again, we're jumping ahead here. I guess I'm a big scientismist in a sense. No, in a sense, because when people say that, I say, yeah, but it's really empirical. When you're doing literature, you're reading the spoken word. The question I was going to ask, let me ask Cornell, because I think he mentions the word revolution. No, because
it's not what you're reading, Lawrence. It's discerning meaning.
I know discerning meaning, but what are you using? You're using reason, experience, evidence, all of the things that I think science uses. So let me throw this out, and you can both jump on me now. I want you to both jump on me because it's part of my anti-religiosity. And that is, I was going to ask you a question. I maintained that no knowledge has ever come by revelation. Now, I know that is an anathema to at least maybe it isn't an anathema to Cornell, but he used the word revelation. You don't use it so much, George and Robert. I mean, I said, oh God, George, Robert,
yeah, well,
because it's all right. They're both. It's probably having two first names, but
I have three actually.
Yeah, it's true. But I don't think revelation is ever. There's no evidence that I can see that I know of, and I'm happy to be wrong here, although no one's yet convinced me that revelation produces knowledge. It's always evidence, reason, deep thought, and to me that's the process of science, and testing your ideas to see if they're right, being willing to change them.
But see,
that's true for literature, humanities, philosophy.
But it's true for science too. But
of course it is,
though, brother. So much hangs on what you mean by revelation. Now, when I hear you say, exemplary physicist, there's no scientific truths, I come to the defense of science and say, yes, there's truths in science. Of course there's truths.
Give me one absolute truth.
No, I didn't say absolute.
Okay. You're right. They're provisional truths.
I didn't say absolute at all. But then you trotted out Karl Popper's falsification. You see, falsification is not the same as warranted assertability. I think Popper's wrong about that. He gets part of it right. He doesn't get enough of it right. Warranted assertability is much more stronger, and it is headed toward a truth pursuit, but it's not capital T truth. It's not absolute truth in that sense. Now,
if there is such a thing.
That means, though, that, and this is where Einstein is right, that the interplay of evidence, argument, intuition, imagination, speculation, evidence underdetermined, making hypotheses that go beyond the evidence that can open up new insights, my brother.
Oh yeah,
that's part of the history of science itself.
Of course,
but if by revelation what we mean is a certain kind of intuition, a certain kind of insight, and goes back, we can get Emersonian and talk about your personal experience when you fell in love. Let's say, were there some revelations that were intuitive that you knew to be true based on your experience, had nothing to do with mathematical knowledge, had nothing to do with quantitative analysis?
Oh, but you just said based on your experience.
In love.
No, but that's
in love.
Where do we should? No, but hold on. Robert, you come in a second. Yes. Well, first of all, let me just say in science, here's what we say. We don't say this is true, this is false. We say this is likely to be correct, this is unlikely to be correct. That's all we do in science, and we can quantify that, which is the beauty of science. We can say,
right. Okay,
and that's it. So it's likely
that's
that the sun will rise tomorrow.
small t.
Very,
That's
very
truth.
likely.
Truths at this moment, small t, are better than the falsehood.
We
Because we're
absolutely.
not relativists. We're not relativists now.
But you said revelation, and I now I want to come back here and really, really, really parse this a little more carefully. Although it's not where I intended to go, but this is so much fun. The You talk about intuition, but intuition is based on experience and based on evidence, past evidence, and even often not always reason applied to it, but some level in which your brain is working. And so there's no insights that you get about the world that are profoundly true or that add to knowledge of the world that aren't based on the reason, reflection, evidence, testing. That's what I would say. And if that's scientism, then that's. But
let me give you a brief
Well,
example before we move to Brother Rob.
Okay.
Move to the fifth section of the Ode on the West Wind
Okay.
by Shelley.
Mm-hmm.
He's talking about muses. He's talking about the way in which the wind has affected the clouds and the waves. And all of a sudden now it's affecting him, so that the very leaves that come out of him become the words themselves. So he calls it inspiration and intuition. Something bigger is working inside of him that's not reducible to just his personal experience. He's opened himself to something. We don't know what it is, but he can't be a reductionist about it. He can't be scientific in the sense that it's got to be only the evidence or only the argument. Something else is happening. Once you open that door, my brother, we with William James and company, right? Is that something more? What is that something more? Oh, things get polyvalent at this point, subject to multiple interpretations. That something more could be a muse. It could be God-like. Socrates himself has voices, right? He's got voices from where? The God, well, it's hard to say. But if we go back to Brother Lawrence in love, something is working through you. Something is affecting you that's not reducible to your personal experience. I think that's true in terms of your magnificent scientific reflection. You're talking about a universe from nothing, and oh my God, you're making all kind of leaps, man. This is fascinating stuff.
This is
the free play of intelligence and intuition, and maybe a little openness to something bigger than Brother Lawrence.
That's why I do science, because the universe, the imagination of the universe is so much greater than the imagination of mine or any humans. I learn from the universe because I'm forced to. You're right. There's something else out there, and that's what science is all about. And I would say, yeah, of course, there's things that are beyond me, but beyond me, in a sense that I only don't know where they come from. But that doesn't mean they don't come from somewhere. They don't just pop into your mind. They come there. Yeah, I can't reduce it to what set of experiences or what because. Perhaps more like you, Brother Cornel, rather than you, Brother Robert. We're not rational.
Say we know where it comes from.
No,
we don't know. We don't know Yahweh. We don't know God. We don't know Jesus. We don't know Allah. We don't know.
Well, we know we created Jesus, but anyway, that's a different story. We'll get to there.
We've got our strong interpretations. No, he's a Palestinian Jewish brother now.
I'm hearing some heavy duty dogmatism here. I don't know.
Okay. But yeah, but but the point is that we, in that sense, again, I know you guys have a dialogue. I think Robert thinks humans are more rational than you do.
Right. That's
I guess I come in the middle somewhere, or maybe I actually no. I'm a big Hume. I do think reason is the slave of passion, and
you do you buy
absolutely.
That
I think if it wasn't, we wouldn't need science. That's my point. We need this well-defined methodology because we all want to believe. We all want things.
You're equating
and science overcomes that. What was that, Robert? Sorry.
I think you're equating all inquiry with science.
Of course.
Now, of course, in the old classic sense of the word, that's true. Science is just the pursuit of knowledge. But
in a way,
come to understand science, and when our listeners hear that word, they're going to be thinking of the natural sciences and the particular methods of appropriate experimentation and so forth that are
testing,
appropriate,
reflection,
testing,
reason,
that kind of stuff. Yeah. Well, now, but of course, some of those, like reflection, pertain not only to the natural sciences but to fields outside the natural sciences. Yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
I mean that's why I don't think it's. I mean, we tend to compartmentalize it. But what I'm saying, when I read throughout your book, both of you, beautiful discussions about testing, reflection, changing your mind, being willing to be wrong, all of that, which is so important to both of you, is central to me. But what I'm saying is that basically, it's not. You often. I'm actually surprised. In some sense, you define it. You base it on the Christian experience, which I was surprised to see personally. But those things are just a process which I think is common to everything. I call it the scientific method, but I just don't see. I see a commonality in the way all music, literature, social science, humanities, and science all go about things, and that commonality are exactly the things you described: reflection, being willing to be wrong, dialectic, discussion, reason, all of that. And when I think of science, that's what I think of. And I don't mean to be either dogmatic or patronizing, because I don't think science is more important than literature or drama or music in any way to the human experience. It tends to work and produce technology, and that therefore it has certain values but it's not fundamentally more important. It's just that it codifies the very things you've been talking about, I think. But again, I don't know if you disagree with me. I'd be happy to hear why if you do.
Well, I'm having trouble, isolating the proposition that you've got on the table for affirmation or dissent.
Well, I'm just saying I don't think I guess what I'm arguing is that there's a commonality to all of human inquiry, all the development of knowledge,
Okay.
and all of it has the same basic tools, the same basic requirements, and I think they're all the opposite of revelation.
Okay, I disagree with the end, but here's what I agree with.
Hmm.
Knowledge is insights. Insights are insights into data.
Hmm.
There is no innate knowledge. That's this mistake to
Oh,
believe that there's innate knowledge. Strictly
okay.
speaking, knowledge is not a matter of intuition. If by intuition we mean literally what intuition means, which is knowledge that is the fruit of no insights into data. So
Yeah.
data-free knowledge. No, and if all knowledge is insights into data, the data are supplied by experience, right? And so knowledge is, in the words of the philosophical theologian Bernard Lonergan, a dynamic combination of experience, understanding, and judgment. All knowledge begins with the senses. This is just classic medieval philosophy, actually.
Well,
And then we move on the basis of our intellectual operations from experience to a certain level of understanding the experience. We identify the conditions under which something will be or not be the case, and if we can then reach the conclusion that the conditions for its being the case have been fulfilled, then we move beyond understanding to judgment. And this is Lonergan's point about knowledge being, or insights being, the product of experience, understanding, and judgment. So the mistaken views on this account are, one, a naive realism, which would simply equate knowledge with experience, and experience makes impressions on the brain, and it just records the stuff like in a dictionary, words in a dictionary back here. No, it's more than that. The second mistake would be to stop at understanding. This is sometimes called idealism epistemologically, that we move from experience to some level of understanding, but we still think that all we can understand is what seems the case to us. We can't reach what is in fact true out there.
hmm
What's called critical realism is the view that we can move from experience to understanding to judgment, so we can say that something is the case out there. And that's going to be true of every discipline, whether the natural sciences, humanities, the social sciences, and if that's what you mean, then I do agree with you that all knowledge, all inquiry has the same basic structure. Where I would disagree, I think, Lawrence, if I'm attributing this to you correctly, and if I'm not, just correct me, is that we can use the same methods, the same methodologies, the same modes of inquiry to figure out what is the case in biology or in physics that we use in, say, history or constitutional or legal interpretation, or the interpretation of literature or music or something like that. There are certain experimental methods that are entirely appropriate in knowledge yielding in chemistry and physics and
That aren't.
biology that are not available to.
I think I would agree with you there. I mean, my point, I think you put the nail on the head, I think, very clearly there, in the sense that when you talked about the last step of judgment, I don't like to use the word judgment myself, but what is the, are we assuming that we're really capturing the real world? Where physics has the advantage is that we don't judge that we're saying we understand the real world by saying we do. We go do an experiment, and if it's wrong,
agreed.
so that's where we have that extra ability to say, are we really understanding the real world? Let's do the experiment. Oh, it was right. Well, maybe we're understanding the real world. So we're being guided by this thing that you don't have the opportunity so much in certain other fields. Although again, I would argue though that you sometimes even do. Let's take literary criticism or something, far removed. You can make an ansatz about Chekhov, as you guys like to talk about, or Joyce. And I was going to ask you why The Dead is the best short story ever written in English.
You just reread it. You get a chance to reread it tonight, and you'll be convinced.
I told myself tonight I'm going to reread it, but I wanted to ask you. I was going to ask you why you thought it was, but let's get there in a second. You can make a presumption about something, and then you can check his other writing, and so you do have access to external modalities, or whatever you want to call it, ways of checking to see if your judgment is correct.
But you remember
there's no problem with that.
But that's not that different than physics.
Run a controlled experiment.
Yeah. It's harder to run control, especially it's in social sciences, probably the hardest place to run controlled experiments because people are so complicated. But
that's the key right there. But there's two things at stake here in a certain sense. One is that the very notion of method, and I talk about Gadamer being my favorite philosopher. I studied with him for a year. His critique of any form of method, as opposed to ways of approaching a subject matter and being respective of what the subject matter is. So I think that there is a continuity between what used to be called the Geisteswissenschaft and the nature of Wissenschaft, the natural sciences and the human. Yeah. I think there's continuity. I don't think there's a major fissure.
Sure.
So C.P. Snow and others, when they talk about the two cultures, they might talk about the descriptive role of physics departments versus English departments. But what's going on at a human level is continuous. So I'm agreeing with you on that, Brother Larry. But the difference is here, though, that in physics, you're not really able to linger long with the why question. When you say it's turtles all the way down, well, that's a conclusion that has a certain conclusion in physics, maybe because you're not living a life. But when you're a participant in living a life, meaning and structures of feeling and structures of appreciation and friendship and love and sacrifice and service to something bigger, you don't have to worry about that with the quantums. You see, you don't have to worry about that with the quantum vacuums and the quantum fluctuations and so forth and so on, right?
It's better than I think you made a really important point, and I think it's one of the reasons people misunderstand these fundamental questions about, why is there something rather than nothing, or it is because, in fact, in science, the why question makes no sense often because it presumes purpose and meaning. Whereas there may be no purpose and meaning. In human affairs, we make our meaning, and that's the difference. We fill our lives with meaning and purpose, and so it's a concept that is familiar to us and integral to our everyday life. But when it comes to understanding the universe, it may just be irrelevant, and it may not be. In fact, I would argue that anytime you ask the why question in science, you're really asking how. You're never presuming purpose.
You see, when you
why would you ask the why question in science?
What was that?
Not science is not about why questions.
I know, but we use it because we're colloquial. You're right. Science is about how, never why. And so it's not why is there something rather than nothing. It's how is there something rather than nothing. But we say it because we're human, and why means so much to us as individuals.
Well, it does, but then there's the domain of why questions, and the intellect is used there as well. And in some ways, it functions exactly the way it functions when we're engaged in scientific inquiry. But we use different methods because the methods of experimental methods, for example, are not going to answer why questions.
Let's see. Why does she love me? Why did I don't know whether experimental
No,
question.
Yeah,
why
you
should I love her?
anyway, then
Why did she? Why did she? Or actually, better still, we've experienced. All of us have had. Why did she leave me?
Well, yeah.
Maybe there are good empirical reasons for that.
Why shouldn't I betray my friend?
But the thing
You know,
is,
there's no way you do a scientific. There's a right answer to the question, why shouldn't I betray my friend? But you don't get at that answer by using the methods that are appropriate in physics or in
Geez,
biology.
I'm sorry. I think you use reason, experience, evidence.
No. We're not,
that's why
again,
you can't-
Lawrence. Of course, you're using reason.
Because you can't answer the question why without knowing what the consequence. But here's the point:
You can't separate
answer
why
the
and
question
how.
why
Can't
without
separate-
knowing how. Right? You can't. If I don't know the impact of my actions, which is science, then I can't answer the question why. Right? Why shouldn't I kill you?
Often you have.
But
Sorry, go
why,
on.
why is a question of explanation? If you have a why question based on the Ptolemaic universe, you've got a problem. So the why and the how are still tied together. If you got a why in terms of your understanding of psychological dynamics, and it's thoroughly pre-Freudian and has nothing to do with certain kinds of instincts and drives, and nothing to do with how cells and egos are constituted, you don't have to be a Freudian to accept those issues being very important, right? So even as Christians, when we ask the why question, we're not unafraid of the how people, of the scientists. We say, bring it on, bring on all the how you can get. Bring down.
But as long as the natural scientists don't become imperialistic, as long as the natural scientists don't become imperialistic and try to answer the why questions with the methods of science, or dismiss the why questions as not valid questions.
Well, yeah.
Why
okay.
should why should I not betray my friend is a perfectly valid question. The intellect can go to work on it, but you're not going to solve it with an experiment.
Okay. Well, let me say that. Let's see if we can find a place to agree here at a point, which is before we move on to maybe the first of the 58 questions I listed down that I was going to ask you. But anyway, here that as long as we accept that there are certain domains where the why question is totally inappropriate, and when it comes to trying to understand the universe, as far as we can tell, and we may one day be wrong on this, the why question is totally irrelevant. But it's not irrelevant when we want to understand the why of human dynamics. Maybe what was that?
If we're trying to understand how
why does the universe exist is not a useful question in science.
No, it's not a scientific question. That's a cosmological one, right? That's a
I'm a cosmologist, but
theological question. Yeah.
Well, it's a theological question because you make it a theological question.
Let's put it this way: is it a valid question?
It's a question we can ask. It's just not useful for science.
If it's a valid question, now can we answer the question, or does it make sense to approach the question by the use of scientific methods? Your answer is going to be no.
Maybe let me step back. It may not be a valid question. I think it's like saying what is the color of the word fast? I mean, that's a question I can ask, but it may not be a valid question.
Exactly right, but it's an unintelligible question. So I think we're driving you to the point where you're going to have to bite the bullet. You're not going to want to do this and say that this question, why, is not a valid question, in the same question of for the same reason that how tall are leprechauns is not a valid question, and yet everybody understands that it's a perfectly valid question.
Well, yeah, okay, interesting point. Which
means we've got to use methods. We're going to have to use the old noggin, the intellect, but approach the problem philosophically, not in terms of physics.
Philosophy, but reflection and reason and evidence. I love, by the way,
but not experimentation.
Oh, I think even for philosophers, there's experimentation.
Well,
there's intellectual experimentation.
There's funny new stuff.
You do thought experiments, don't you? You do thought experiments, like Einstein did. I mean, you have a different kind of thought experiments.
They're not controlled experiments.
Well, no, but if you say you're a utilitarian, like my friend Peter Singer, who I know you both.
We know securely. We're trying to answer a question that we have by comparing possible answers to knowledge that we have securely. That's all thought experiments end up being.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not what scientists characteristically do. They do experiments.
Yeah, that well, I'm a theorist, so I do
Well,
both.
yeah,
But
Yeah,
but I do, yeah, I
eerie
do
and
thought experiments in my head. But let me just ask a question. My
Mhm.
problem with the word why, and then we'll go somewhere else, is not a problem. It's just that why presumes purpose. So why is a useful question when you're thinking about purpose, and it's not a useful question when you're not thinking about purpose. Can we agree on that?
I think we can, but I don't think you want to be dogmatic and assuming that there's no purpose.
No, no. Well, no,
No,
absolutely.
right,
We
yeah,
shouldn't be
okay.
dogmatic. There may be, as I often tell people, if tonight I looked up at the sky and the stars rearranged themselves either in Aramaic or Hebrew or even English to say I'm here, then I might begin to think a little differently about the universe than I do. But so I'm game. Just do
But
it
you
for
remember,
me. Just do it for me, and
no,
I'm
you
there.
remember though, brother, that our conception of truth is very both Greek and Heideggerian. I hate to invoke the Nazi gangster, but he's got some philosophical insight here.
Mm-hmm.
It's aletheia, it's revealment and concealment. Now, that's true when it comes to nature. That's true when it comes to human relations. That's true when it comes to a whole host of contexts.
Yeah,
So,
sure.
but the difference is the difference between purpose and prediction. You see that for the most part, the new sciences, after Descartes especially, is really much about predicting future experience in light of past experience. And
Mm-hmm.
that's a certain kind of purpose, but it's very, very small p. Prediction. Prediction is the purpose of science. That's the reason why you engage, and that's what how talk is all
That's
about. We're talking
all it's
about
all
how it's
about.
all about. Now, why talk is not about prediction at all. It's about purpose in a more meaningful, substantive sense of purpose, right?
Well, when you say more meaningful, it's in a way that creates meaning. I mean, the why
Well,
question creates
Well,
meaning in a
you sort
sense.
of dogmatically
but the
assert
thing is
that,
the
but that's an assertion.
What? Well, I mean, the question is
That
that,
it creates meaning. I mean, the
well, I mean,
inquiry might be into what is the meaning of this. It's
yeah,
not,
yeah,
well,
that's right.
what should I create?
Or what is meaning
but
might be even more basic
that's the
this is
question.
what,
meta.
because
Yeah.
you remember the moment that we talked about in Nietzsche, right? When Nietzsche
Yeah,
says, "What makes us think that truth is a good thing? What makes us think that the truth doesn't lead to self-destruction? What makes us think when we raise the issue of meaning that meaninglessness is where the evidence points?" And I see that's where Nietzsche's headed. That's exactly where Leopardi's headed. That's where Kafka in certain moments headed. But Kafka is so complicated that he's got
yeah,
so much love flowing through him, and you can see it with Samsa and his sister and so forth. So that there's more going on in Kafka because he's just subject to so many interpretations, and there's no way of choosing one or the
yeah,
other oftentimes. But it means then, though, that nihilism, which is lack of meaning, is also an answer to the question of meaning. So we
yeah.
can't we can't assume that by raising the question of meaning that is going to move toward me and Brother Robbie's position, because
Yeah,
we're
no, I think
over
that's
against the nihilism of all varieties, but we know we have to wrestle with it.
yeah. I mean, but to me, it's the sort of my life work in physics, say, and my knowledge of physics leads me to the empirical likelihood that there is no meaning to the universe. And so I become, I
Well,
guess,
get
I
that.
would say the empirical evidence suggests, makes me, in the terms you'd put it, as a nihilist. I don't think of it that way because I do think people make their own meaning when it comes to the human experience. But cosmically, there's no meaning to or purpose to our existence or to the universe. And the only reason I say that is because I see no evidence in everything I've studied about the universe. Now, other people obviously can come to different conclusions, but that's I've been driven to it by my study of the universe, not because of maybe I have some inner predilection to be a nihilist. I don't know, but I like to think I've been driven by evidence rather than bias. But we're all
You,
driven.
you haven't been. You haven't
Oh,
been.
why? Thank
For
you for
this
letting me
reason.
know.
Right, yeah. Yeah. You presupposed what I think you previously denied,
What?
which is that you can use the methods of science to reach profitably study questions that are not themselves appropriate for science.
Well,
It's
no,
not the evidence of science that is driving you to say that the why questions are out of bounds.
let me.
Because the apparatus of science simply can't address those questions. So you got to choose which one. You can
No, I
either
think
say
let me
one of
be a
two
little
things.
clearer then. And it's undoubtedly my fault, Robert, not yours here for misunderstanding me because let me look, I guess when I first became sort of well known outside, I mean, to some extent publicly, was when I fought for teaching of intelligent design in high schools.
Yeah.
The biologists weren't doing their job at the time, and I spent a lot of time, so I saw it as an attack on science, this effort to put intelligent design in the high school biology classroom. And so let's take intelligent design as an example. So intelligent design is somehow says that the evidence tells us that cells were clearly designed, and and in fact, it's the opposite. The evidence tells us that there's no that in particular there's no evidence of any conscious design when it comes to life, and that doesn't mean there isn't, by the way. It just means there's nothing specific that tells you, yes, you had to insert an intelligence in order to make this cell function this way. It couldn't have done otherwise. There's no way natural processes could do it. There's no way evolution could do it. And by evolution, I mean not an undirected process, but a process directed by natural selection and mutation. So there's an example of what I mean. I think that the evidence, there's no evidence of explicit design. And that's all science can do. What science can't do, I agree with you, is say there's no designer. That I think is true. But I think science can say, is there any evidence that you need an intelligence beyond just chemistry and physics and natural processes to get from A to B? And so I think that's a valid thing.
Sounds to me like you've got some adversaries who think that you can use scientific methods to arrive profitably at answers or to analyze profitably why questions. And if your point against them is, well, no, scientific methods are not appropriate to that subject matter. They can't profitably address the why questions. Well, then I agree with you. But if it seemed to me you were making a stronger point, and I apologize if I missed you, which was that you can use the scientific method to show that there's no answer to the why questions.
No. All you can do is no. I guess I'm just trying to say it's quite limited. Science is much more humble, and even I am than people sometimes claim. But the point is that all we can ask is where does the evidence lead us? And if you can just say, is there evidence for X? Is there evidence for purpose? And you can say, I have no evidence for purpose. That doesn't mean there's no purpose, but I can at least use a scientific method to look for evidence of purpose. Do you agree with that?
Oh, sure.
It seems to me, well, I guess maybe I'm the outlier here. I mean, I don't see what the scientific method itself is going to do to help you with the why questions. So I mean, it seems to me that
let's get away from why to purpose. Okay.
Well, I just take those as synonymous.
Okay. Well, I mean, you really don't think that science can't look at the history of biology and ask, is there a purposeful direction to evolution? And you can ask that question, and the answer, maybe we don't know, or the answer is yes or no. And I think what biology would say is there's no evidence that evolution has a purposeful direction. And I think that's a fair scientific question, and one in which the biology community has definitively answered. Do you not agree? Yeah, guys, I'm glad to see Cornel's on my side here at least. Anyway,
well,
let me give you an example. Sorry, go on.
Particular moment. In the end, I'm still very much with Robbie, but let's look at it just slightly differently. Let's look at it slightly differently. Let's look at it from the vantage point of human experience in history, right? So you got Hume's Dialogues on Natural Religion, or Schelling's Essay on the Essence of Human Freedom, or the powerful text, the prose poem in Grand Inquisitor, right? So you got Jewish brothers and sisters in concentration camps.
Yeah.
Right? You got African brothers and sisters on slave ships. You got Armenians. You got Palestinians in Gaza. You got Muslim Uyghurs in China. And we say, well, what evidence would lead us to infer that there is a good God, that there is a powerful God? And at that point, it's not a creative designer going through nature. We're talking about it's going through our hearts and minds and souls.
Mm-hmm.
And so to Brother Robbie and I say, well, in the face of that overwhelming evidence of human wretchedness that is persistent every generation, I just used a few examples, but
I love you use the word wretched. I love it. I'm going to use it so much more often now than I did before. After reading the book. You know, and when you talk about, but
it
you're
doesn't have the last word. That is to say that there is still some counter evidences available to human beings, no matter how weak and feeble they are, that lead us to infer that as wretched as we are, it doesn't cancel all of the love, the joy.
The joy. I was waiting for you to use the word joy.
Oh, absolutely.
That's what makes you, that's it from Nietzsche and you, is that, yes, the world is wretched, but it's also joyful. And you know, by the way, here's my late friend, Cormac McCarthy, who
one of the
good friend.
One of the great novelists now.
But when I first met him, you know, his books are dark, many of them. And he was such a chipper, happy guy. And I remember meeting him and we started chatting. I said, "How can you be so happy?" And he said this to me, which is actually now my mantra, and maybe it'll be you can use it too, Cornel. He said, "Well, I'm a pessimist, but that's no reason to be gloomy."
That's wonderful.
Isn't that wonderful?
Steal that one.
Yeah, it's a steal. I remembered it from the day he told me about it.
That's Arthur Schopenhauer, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Philosopher of pessimism, who goes to the opera every night and has wonderful times with his dog. And I was just reading Mapul Sartre's short story, Beside Schopenhauer's Corpse.
Mm-hmm.
This is a short story of a follower of Schopenhauer and Mapul Sartre reflecting on their hero, and he's laughing as he's on his deathbed, just like William Blake. He has a smile with a laugh. Blake's laughing because he's invoking Jesus Christ. Schopenhauer's laughing for we don't know what, but he still has that counter effort against the kind of wholesale pessimism. And I think that the McCormick is saying, look, I'm as pessimistic as Leopardi, but I'm not gloomy.
Exactly. Joy. The joy. Absolutely.
When we look at those people in the concentration camps, when we look at those people in slavery, and we ask ourselves the question, should I oppose that? Or should I support that? Or more to the point, why should I oppose it if in fact I should oppose it? We're not going to get anywhere. We wouldn't credit somebody who said, well, I got an equation here.
No, but you might say...
We wouldn't get anywhere if somebody said, well, I'm going to run an experiment that will show you. We're going to use our intellects to try to get at the answer, to try to show that there is, in fact, a profound, inherent, and equal human dignity that's being violated by the slave system, by the concentration camps, by the Nazis, right? But we're not going to use the methods of the natural sciences.
I think we do. Sorry, a little bit. I mean, you talk about inherent human dignity a lot in the book, and I'm sure in life, and I know that it's central. Part of your belief in the inherent human dignity not just come from Thomas Jefferson, but from the Bible, from the inherent God.
Well, I think the Bible articulates it.
Okay,
not
from God. But I would argue that one can come to the same conclusion without God, and because we share, and I think we can use the methods of science. We can use the methods of genetics to say we all humans share. I share a common humanity with you for so many biological, with both of you, with all humans. Not only that, I share atoms. I'm breathing in the atoms today that you breathed out the other day. And so we share all of this common humanity. And I would argue, in some sense, for me, science, in every way, we have the same DNA, we have the same ATP, we have the same nucleic acids. That inherent commonality, it tells me that all humans deserve the same kind of dignity or same kind of treatment because we are the same.
There you go. Everything was science up until that last.
I know.
Conclusion.
Well, but okay? What I'm saying is I use the results
of judgment, but you did not reach that valid judgment.
Of course, I agree. You can't get aught from is. Okay, but you can get damn close. But I guess my point is,
you can't even get
but here's
close.
Will you agree with me? Hold on. Can't get aught from is.
Conclusions.
I guess my point is you can't get aught from is, but you can't get aught without is. If you don't know what is, then any conclusions you have about aught are ridiculous.
Absolutely. We've all said that a million times. That's not.
No, you're right about that. You're right about that. You're right.
I mean, I've got to know whether that's a human being in the bush
Mhm.
and not, say, a rabbit that I'm hunting in order to know whether to shoot into the bush. But it's not by the scientific methods that would show me that it's a human being rather than a rabbit that I
Well,
decide if it's a human
it's
being, I
reason.
shouldn't shoot.
Well,
Of course, it's
let me get.
reason.
I've
That's my
asked the
whole
question.
point.
I was addressing his Islamic audience once, and well, I've done this a bunch of times, and I basically said, so the question is, why do you kill your neighbor? And I asked, if you stop believing in God, would you kill your neighbor? And at once someone put up their hand. Okay, but most of the time, people realize that they wouldn't do it, and they realize they wouldn't do it for a whole bunch of reasons that they thought about what if I kill my neighbor, then my neighbor can kill me, and we can't have a society together. And I mean, I think Cornell in your book echoes. I thought of Rousseau when you said this, Cornell. You said basically we can't have freedom without constraints. Now I know you guys criticize Rousseau, but to me that's the same as him saying, man is born free but forever lives in chains. I mean, it's the same idea that if we allow each other to kill our neighbors and don't have any constraints on that, then we have anarchy, and we'll have clearly and then I can ask, what does anarchy mean? It means that I can be killed when I walk out my door, and maybe I don't want that to be the case. So it seems to me there's a whole bunch of rational, reason-based arguments why you should behave in the way that you might think uh, would be based on values.
Brother Lawrence, you raised that question to the Muslim audience,
Yeah.
and only the one person puts up his hand. Okay, I get that. But ask yourself this question. Is Alexander the Great great?
Oh, I know that's in your book. Okay.
Yeah. And the
Yeah.
answer to that is no.
Well, no, I don't think. I think that's dogmatic. I think the
Oh,
answer
okay.
is
Now,
the answer is it's
okay.
complicated, right?
Come on.
There was certain greatness in him. In fact, I too was in a movie once, but with Werner Herzog made me a villain in one of his movies, and there's a great line in that movie. Someone's talking about Alexander the Great, and someone gives him a cup of water, when the troops are starving, and he pours it out, and he says, "Too much for one, not enough for many." So he didn't want to drink water when the troops were not, and so that's kind of great, even if what you're saying is that power isn't greatness. I know the point you're making is that power isn't greatness, but that doesn't mean he wasn't great, right?
Alexander the Great was not called Alexander the Great because he poured the water out. Alexander the Great was called Alexander the Great because he showed that he could conquer and dominate and subjugate people all over the known world. That was why he was given the title the Great. And for an enormous number of people throughout history and even today, it's in something like that. Conquest, domination, subjugation, that greatness lies. It's not kind of like written into the code of the human mind.
I'm surprised because you say the opposite in your book. You say that if I have students now, would they say he's great? You claim, I was surprised you'd say most people would say he's not great. And I was surprised because we have Make America Great Again for the same reason. Subjugation, all of that crap that you just talked about is what people are voting in this current administration.
Throughout most of history and across cultures, people have identified greatness. Now, let's get to my students, right? And most of my students would say he's not great. Now, what accounts for that? What accounts for the fact that my students don't see things today? Most of my students are secular, but what accounts for them not seeing things today the way people in Alexander the Great's time, and a lot of other people in the world today, saw as great? Now, there's no way to tell that story with leaving religion out of the picture. There's no way to tell that story without leaving Christianity out of the picture. The reason people don't think Alexander the Great is great, the reason my students today, and the reason you, and the reason Brother Cornel and me are not like the people in Alexander the Great's time who regarded him as great because he was capable of subjugation, domination, conquest, is that we're heirs to a culture which celebrates compassion, decency, care, goodness, the widow, to care for the widow, the orphan, the loving, what's the Hebrew word for loving kindness, Cornell?
Hesed, my brother.
Hesed. As Hesed, yeah.
But the reality here is, though, that the concrete history based on evidence and experience leads us to conclude that religious and non-religious folk specialize in killing other people.
Yeah,
absolutely.
The dominant
and
mode, right?
you
So
make that point really well. Yeah.
Okay, so that I think what Robbie and I do overlap would be, well, we're convinced that even looking at the dark side, the underside of Christendom, which has a long history.
Yeah, long and checkered history.
Jews against Arabs, against Turks,
Yeah.
black folk,
Crusades,
women,
yeah.
and so forth. That love ethic, that love ethos, that love enacted and embodied, is still a fundamental source of a countervailing force against this Alexander the Great definition of greatness.
Yep.
Well, look, I think it's one of, this is where and again, I recognize I recognize expertise that both of you have that, although I'm a student of history, probably not adequately as much as either of you, but my perception, based on my limited knowledge, is that Christianity was around for a long time when those wonderful things you're talking about weren't necessarily a central piece of societal infrastructure, and people didn't innately have the kind of sensibilities that we have today. And I would argue it comes from the Enlightenment, not so much from religion.
No,
I know you disagree with me, Robert, but I think if you look, there's nothing changed about Christianity between then and now, but there's a huge thing that's changed in society. And if I can look historically, I would say, well, maybe the Enlightenment caused people to be able to ask questions, reason, change their minds, realize that there are no authorities. By the way, you're a big person on authority, and both of you talk about authority, and authority is an anathema to science. In fact, one thing I want you to do.
You believe in the authority of science.
Well, no. They're scientific experts. In fact, there's a great quote, and I want you to use this in your class.
You're in your biologists and their
hold on. Next time you teach your class,
against
there's this great quote. I looked at the books. I love the books: Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas, Joyce, Eliot. There's great. The one person you're missing that you should put in there is Galileo. You should have readings if you don't. And and here's what Galileo said. In the sciences, the authority of thousands of opinions is not worth as much as one tiny speck of reason in an individual man. And I think that's the point of science. There are no authorities. Any professor can be wrong. Any student can say you made a mistake.
That's absolutely true.
I agree with that.
But when you talk about the Enlightenment,
I agree with that.
Let's see. When you talk about the Enlightenment, could you have gotten Soviet communism without the Enlightenment? Could you have gotten Nazism without the Enlightenment?
Okay, knowledge doesn't necessarily make you. Reason doesn't.
No.
Like,
I mean, it's a
could you have
tighter
gotten
question than that. It's a tighter question than that.
Well, hold on.
You've gotten these unprecedented tyrannies and totalitarian systems of the 20th century. Unknown. There's a lot of bad stuff.
No, you could have gotten the tyrannies of the 4th century, or 6th century,
which are really bad. But
different
Soviet
tyrannies,
communism or Nazi Germany, and the answer to that is clearly no.
Well, why? I'm not so sure. Marx is a philosopher.
Yeah. Is it a
what did he
corruption of the
science for?
Enlightenment? Is it a corruption of Enlightenment ideals? Absolutely a corruption of Enlightenment ideals. But just as there were many corruptions of Christianity. But it's by reference to those ideals, whether they're Christian ideals or Enlightenment ideals, that you critique the abuses and make it possible to overcome them, which I think was Cornel's point.
Yeah, I guess so. It just seems to me, if I look at things and the notion, which is Cornel would say, has been abused as often in a scientific world as a non-scientific world, because we are all wretched. But I would argue that the notion that people should be treated equally, the notion that people of a different color are not fundamentally different, is, I would say, science has helped push that notion forward far more than religion, in my opinion.
No.
No.
The Imago Dei. The Imago Dei. Honestly, you get
look at the
scientific
polygenesis.
racism out of the Enlightenment. You get scientific racism.
But you know
of
that
the
slavery
19th
was also
century.
you know that slavery was justified
not
by religion as
race-based
much as
chattel,
anything
Yes, it
not
else.
was.
race-based
Yes,
chattel
it was.
slavery.
But
And
it
what
was
and
19th century science. You got the polygenesis of the black folk
Of course, you get
originated
these
from one
abuses,
source
but I'm
as
saying
opposed to
at a
another.
fundamental
It was the
level,
religious
and
folk that were calling for the common origin
I
and the
know people can
common
abuse it, but
dignity.
I'm saying
But
the
both
fact is that you
Cornell's
have the
making a
same
stronger
DNA
point
as
than
I do,
that.
that you have the same biological processes, that everything about your body is the same as mine. And in every sense, that factual bit of evidence is profoundly important
that's
in the
true. No, I
recognition to
agree with
me.
that.
And so that's what I mean by this. I mean, I'm
I
not
agree.
saying
But
science
let me
wasn't
give you an
abused in
example.
every way.
So
Let me give you an example. Let me
of
give you a good example of that. July 4th, 1910, you got Jack Johnson fighting against Jeffries, right? Reno,
Yeah.
Nebraska. If you
Yeah.
say they both have the same kind of biological structure, they say that same kind of protons and neutrons shot through them. But when Jack Johnson knocks out that vanilla brother, and within 2 hours, they kill 10 black people across the nation, all of those cells and protons and neutrons are not doing enough moral work for people to accept this black man as a human being who
That's
deserves.
because humans are flawed. We all agree with that, or maybe not
Now,
Robert
I'm not
so
saying
much.
that we religious folk have been on the cutting edge all the time, not even most of the time. I'm saying in both cases, when it comes to the authority of science, how we define authority, authority of religion, whatever religion you're talking about, Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, what is casteism, is a slice in each tradition that has been able to hold it together. Diderot is a great example of the Enlightenment, who is anti-imperial, anti-racist, I mean, that's a very rare thing. Same is true with Harriet Tubman, who Robbie knows well because he had her Bible in his hand.
That's
And
right.
Harriet Tubman doesn't represent all of Christianity. She's a particular black Christian woman who's loving everybody, no matter what color. Same would be true with King. Same would be true with Rabbi Heschel. Same would be true with Dorothy Day. These are they who constitute the prophetic slice of secular and religious tradition. And that's
there's a book that I wonder if you've read. It's by my colleague here at Princeton, Tom Leonard. Do you know Thomas Leonard, Tim Leonard in the history department?
I just know the name, though, brother.
Do you know the book? It's called Illiberal Reformers. Lawrence, is that a book?
No, I know.
Yes,
I've heard the title, but I haven't read the book. No.
Wonderful. It's a wonderful book, but boy, it's a sobering book. It's a look at the eugenics movement and who was where in the eugenics movement, and it makes very clear that the great and the good, the scientific establishment, the academic establishment, the leaders of American business, the leaders of the great foundations, the Rockefellers,
They were
the
all the
Fortune,
ones pushing.
they were all behind, and it was all in the name of science and in the name of Enlightenment ideals. And they really thought, what kind of fool would be against improving the human race? Now, we know that what was wrong with eugenics now, today, is not just that they got the science wrong. It was that they had a fundamentally false understanding of human meaning and value. Things that cannot be understood except by reference to things you cannot taste, touch, smell, feel, things that you can't inquire into by scientific methods.
Well,
And of course, the only people who are standing up against eugenics
that may be
in
the
those
case.
days.
But here's the problem, and I'm going to jump in because I know I do value your time. I may not sound like I am because I hope we can go for another 20 minutes if you don't mind.
I can't believe it's already 10
I know.
past 3.
I thought I want you to. Isn't this great? When we can go 2 hours and it doesn't feel like it, to me, that's the wonderful thing.
I just cancel my 3 o'clock dialogue because this is too rich. This is too rich.
Loved
I'm not leaving this. I'm not leaving this.
I loved you before. I love you more now. But anyway, this is great. Thank you. I'm honored. I'm actually truly honored by that because. But let me. You hit a point there, and again, it was a point I was going to go to later, and now I'm going to it now because I'm not going to get to everywhere. You talked about they misunderstood human value, and I would agree. Okay. The one thing that does concern me, and it's somewhere in the book, and Robert, you say this explicitly, more or less, that there are things that should not be done that are wrong, that we should not allow because more or less it goes against Christian values, or at least it goes against values which you derive from being Christian. And the problem you
Yeah.
talk about,
And-
well, you talk about the economy, you talk about the market economy. There's some things thou shalt not do. There's some things that should not be sold. They're not there. And what I always worry about that is
I made no appeal to the authority of the Bible or
no,
the
maybe
Christian
not the
faith,
authority of the Bible, but the question,
or the
but,
Christian faith.
but
I
you,
mean,
you make, but what you make appeal to is the authority of what is right and wrong. And you've, and
oh yeah.
okay,
Well,
fine.
yeah.
But here's my problem with that. And it's always been, who determines what's right and wrong?
Well,
That's what the
Right.
problem is. Because I agree with you. And if you were determining for me what was right or wrong, I'd feel totally comfortable. But if Donald Trump was determining for me what's right or wrong, I wouldn't feel so comfortable. So who determines this stuff? That's what bothers me about it.
Well, all right. So each of us, of course, has no choice but to decide for himself what is right or wrong. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have corporate decisions that need to be made, right? Including about what's right or wrong. Are we going to have a system of slavery or not? I can't dictate that individually. You can't dictate that individually. You and I can have individual view about whether slavery is right or wrong. We have to have one. But somebody's got to decide for the society whether slavery is right or wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And there are different decision procedures that have been proposed over the years. These are the political scientists classify them as types of regimes. You can have a monarchical regime. You can have an aristocratic or oligarchic. You can have a democratic process. And my own view of the matter is the best way of handling, the least bad way of handling them is with a mixed regime. One that corresponds more or less to what the American founders had in mind when they, distinguishing it from a democracy, said that we should have a republic. So we're going to make our decisions corporately, and they're going to be important democratic elements of the decision procedure, but they will be constrained by, for example, a constitutional system of checks and balances, and by, for example, having constitutional guarantees that the judiciary is empowered to rule on, not getting the final say in every case, but nevertheless having a role. I think that's the safest and the best we can do. So what I do say, I think what you were pointing to is that while I believe in the market, and I probably would give more room for the market to operate than Brother Cornel would,
Yes.
I agree with Brother Cornel that not everything should be determined by the market. There are some things that should not be for sale, like human beings, for example, should not be for sale. Now, we're going to have to make a decision about whether I'm right about that. Now, what's the procedure for making a decision? I kind of like our constitutional Republican system. I wouldn't want a pure democracy. Just put it up for a vote, then we all, raise our hands and we decide. I want a system of checks. I want constraints on power, even the power of the demos. So I'm not strictly speaking a Democrat, but I want important democratic elements to the process, subject to the checks and balances that make us, strictly speaking, a republic rather than a democracy. Cornel, where are you on this?
Well, I mean, a lot of this hangs on what we understand the background conditions to be. You know what I mean? That if the condition for the possibility even of the republic that you're talking about is, massive massacre of people or enslavement of people, that has to be taken into consideration in terms of the concrete history, the actual history itself. I think in terms of my commitment to democratic practices and counter-majoritarian institutions contributing to democratic practices. So you have to have courts that preserve rights and liberties. That's a precondition of any democracy, and the courts do not proceed in a democratic manner. Their role is to ensure that civil liberties and rights of people, against the censoring, against the violation of free speech and free expression and so forth, their role is to create the preconditions for democratic flourishing. And so that's part of the separation of checks and balances, I think, that Robbie's talking about.
Absolutely, which is essential to us right now, and maybe not.
Yeah,
we're relying on it right now.
But part of the problem there is, though, I mean, even with the courts, we've had Supreme Court justices who were slaveholders and
of course,
supporters and so forth. Because
Well,
if
there's no guarantee.
you are the
There's no
people,
guarantee. All we can do is
no guarantee.
arrange a system
Exactly.
that would give us the best chance,
Absolutely.
the
Without
safest, exercise some caution. So you don't want a monarchical system. You might begin today with a wonderful monarch. Our founders had the opportunity to make, he resisted it, which made him the perfect
George
monarch.
Washington.
He didn't want to be monarch. They could have appointed Washington. But then what happens next, right? You can try to do something where you identify the greatest group, among the group, and you have an aristocracy. Well, that generally doesn't work out very well in the end. So, democracies have their flaws.
Yeah.
Part of why I don't want an unrestrained democracy. I want a constrained democracy.
we know the tyranny of the majority.
We do know the tyranny of the majority.
There's nothing that the tyranny of the majority is very real. So I just don't think there's any perfection here. We just have to that's why, did I describe it a moment ago as the least bad?
Right. Yeah. But when you talk about the tyranny of the majority, actually it leads to another point, which I remember from the book and an important discussion when we talk about Martin Luther King and just laws and civil disobedience, which of course I sympathize with tremendously. The question, of course, but what surprised me once again, Robert, I think, more than Cornel, and I'm going to call you Brother Robert and Cornel, because at this point we're brothers. As far
Absolutely.
but yeah. But
and I'm a
Robert
brother
would
of
say,
your brother. So that,
well, yeah. Anyway, I like to think that I've risen. Maybe one day I'll rise. But anyway, that you argue in some sense that that just laws, more or less, you can't determine what's just laws without a religion. And I mean, I can get the quote if you want, but more or less,
I'm kind of notorious for holding the view that's sometimes called natural law theory.
I know. I don't want to misquote you. I'm going to quote you in this one. You say,
I'm all for religion, by the way. I mean, I'm not running away from religion.
But you talk about let's see. I'm hoping this is you. Yeah, it is you. Now we talk about a republican civic order, and we can have government not only of the people, by the people, etc. But of course, in a republican civic order, the people are themselves, in a certain sense, sovereign. But it will only work if the people understand that, though sovereign in one sense, they are subject to a higher law. What King had in mind when he referred to the natural law and the law of God. Are you therefore saying that you cannot have a republic without a recognition of the natural law of God? With that, it won't be functional.
Oh, okay. So
that's what I'm asking.
Law and the law of God. So for King, we're under judgment. Where the human law is under the judgment of a higher law. And then he says the natural law and the law of God. The natural law is the moral law, including principles of justice, right ordering of society, insofar as they are ascertainable by unaided human reason, even apart from revelation.
Hold on. Is they're ascertainable unaided by human reason?
No. Unaided reason. That is reason unaided by revelation. That's
okay.
So right, okay. Then there's the second thing that is the law of God. Now, the law of God can mean different things. Sometimes it's the medievals would refer to it as the eternal law. That is the ordering of the universe by God as the creator of the universe. I think what you need to have any kind of a just system is the apprehension by the rulers, by the people themselves ideally, but at least by the rulers, that they are accountable to a higher law. Now, it'll be good enough if they believe there's a rationally attainable higher law. If they're Aristotle, that'll work.
Okay.
For King, it wasn't just the natural law.
Yeah, for King
it was also the
for you, I think it's fair to say, right?
Yeah. So, well, yeah. I mean, I'm a believer. I believe in God. So
yeah,
I would say with Lincoln that we're a nation under judgment, and that is that we're answerable to God. The kings, the presidents, they didn't create our rights. They didn't confer them on us. Therefore, they cannot legitimately take them away. They're not given to us by any human power. Now, where do they come from? We can have a debate about where they come from. I'm going to ultimately say, well, ultimately, things are the way they are because God created the reality in the way it is. But whether or not you reach that judgment, if you reach the judgment that there is a moral law above the human law, and it's knowable by our natural reason, that gives you what you need to have a republic, so that rulers understand that they are answerable to principles of justice, that there's something beyond the mere positive law. They can't make something true simply by making it law.
Okay.
They can't make slavery okay by creating a law permitting slavery.
Yeah,
It's still wrong under the higher law.
To reality, which you guys talk about a little bit. I mean, in some sense, reality has to win, and reality is.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, being in touch with reality. That's right.
One of my favorite science fiction writers wrote a quote. Said, "Reality is that which continues to exist even when you stop believing in it." Philip Dick.
Oh, that's
Philip K. Dick.
Philip K. Dick.
Dick.
That's
yeah.
good.
So I think it's.
Well, you see, that was exactly the issue between Tagore and Einstein. When Tagore said there is no reality independent of human perception, almost like Berkeley. And Einstein said, I'm more religious than you. Reality is independent of human consciousness. And he says, how do you know? That's the postulate that I make. That's a certain kind of fiduciary element of my human inquiry. That's a trust or faith that I have. Reality is independent of human perception.
I'll give you a little. I'll give you a little tool I often use. It doesn't, and of course, you can't convince people of things they don't want to believe anyway. But people who talk about consciousness as somehow creating reality, as if human consciousness is important, they misunderstand quantum mechanics when they think human consciousness is relevant. It's not important in quantum mechanics at all. But the best example is simply to look out at night at stars that are 2 million light years away. Actually, we're 20 million light years away, which existed and for which the chemistry of and nuclear physics of those stars was perfectly well producing exactly the same thing as our sun was doing before human consciousness existed. So the very fact that those stars were working very well back then, and we can see it because we have the evidence of 20 million years ago, means that the human consciousness is irrelevant to the functioning of reality. So it's a good
like that. Lord, what I usually do is appeal to just everyday experiences. Josiah Royce and others used to do this. Namely, this wonderful conversation we've had right now, there's no way it can be undone. That the passage of time is such that we started at T1 and we're now at T22, and we never can undo what has been done. That is a truth that can never be reversed.
It's amazing, although we don't understand time very well. But you're right. Some people would argue that time itself is an illusion. I say that that's not an illusion, because if you had to teach a class 15 minutes ago, it wouldn't be an illusion when the students would be mad at you.
They'd be upset.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. But
25 years from now, the three of us will be physically dead.
Yeah, absolutely.
Consciousness. That's not a mental projection. All you got to do is look at our coffins.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, the point is that, but anyway, I wanted to give you that little tool because I think it's important to really point out how relevant human consciousness is because quantum mechanics gets abused.
Right. No, I agree.
To elevate human consciousness or consciousness beyond that. And I think anyway, I forget how we got there, but that.
That's right.
I'm going to ask you three more questions, and I'm going to let you go because I could talk. Well, I could spend the whole. I mean, I'm enjoying it. Let me ask you one. I'll ask truth and beauty. I want to get away from this.
This is for Cornel.
I know it's for Cornel because Cornel's truth and beauty. He said truth is inseparable from beauty, goodness, even the holy. Truth talk without beauty talk is impoverishing. And then he quoted John Keats, which is a lovely statement: "Beauty is truth, truth beauty." I love that. But let me give another quote of that you may not know, but of a mathematical physicist, Hermann Weyl, lived around the same time as Einstein, and did some important stuff. Hermann Weyl said, and I love this quote because it demonstrates he's a mathematician. He said, "When I have to choose between truth and beauty, I choose beauty." And he could do that because he was a mathematician. I claim the sad thing about being a physicist is you don't have that option. And so what if truth isn't beautiful is what I want to ask you for now.
Well, I mean, that was a certain version of the Nietzschean point that we made before, right?
Mhm.
But if truth, the value of truth itself has been overvalued, but truth itself generates such negative, destructive consequences, right? And that's what you see in Iceman Cometh by Eugene O'Neill. People can't face the truth about themselves.
Yeah.
Dostoevsky says, you can't face the truth about themselves. Reality is too heavy. The burden of freedom is too overwhelming. Well, that's that's a serious challenge. It really is. I just think that one has to answer these kind of questions for oneself and try to make the strongest case. And as I mentioned with the Rilke quote about not just answering the question, but living the question, because there's no theoretical resolution of the question. It's an existential affair. Back to Kierkegaard again. It's an existential affair. It really is. And I think somebody like Keats reminds us. Think of the great philosophers who put beauty at the center. Whitehead would say the same thing that the brother who I didn't know of, but I want to read more about him. Whitehead would say the same thing. George Santayana would say the same thing. Truth has been overvalued. Beauty is much more important, but the two are so intertwined. I think there's something to be said for that.
Well, yeah, I guess for me, the thing I guess is beauty is in the eye of the beholder. I hope truth is.
Oh, no. It's not just to be an eye of the beholder. Partly so, but not only. Those stars that you see, that's not just your eyes. The symmetry of a mathematical equation, that's not just your eye. The beauty in Grand Canyon that generates a sense of the sublime that moves.
But let me give you an example of the let me give you an example you use. Let me turn to you.
Doing some work, bro.
No, I know, but let me turn to a source of wisdom, namely you. And say, okay, truth is sometimes not beautiful in the sense that the truth is that humans are wretched.
That's right.
But I think you would say, in fact, I know you'd say, because I think you say it later in the book, but and in general in other places, and I would agree with you, that doesn't make it not beautiful. The fundamental tragedy of being human is beautiful itself, because we have the option of joy, we have the option of goodness, we have all of those things. And so the fact that humans aren't good necessarily doesn't make it less beautiful, because we're so complicated and all of those possibilities of existence are there, and that's beautiful. So you could.
I think what you just said is beautiful, brother. You sounding poetic, not just physicists either. That's pure poetry, man.
Well, yeah, that's a high compliment.
Melville says in the greatest short story written by an American, Billy Budd, that truth is a jagged edge.
Mm-hmm.
It cuts a variety of different ways, right? Now, when I say that Jesus Christ is the truth, and people say, oh my God, he's really lost his mind at that point. Well, that includes what? That includes the cross. That includes the wretchedness. That includes the love. That includes the greed and hatred and so forth. And at the same time, that includes the blood at the bottom of that cross that generates possibilities of a love that even the most powerful empire in the history of the world at that moment cannot crush out. It cannot erase. It cannot eliminate. So when Jesus says, I am the truth, it's an existential truth that says, I can embrace all of this wretchedness, look unflinchingly at the darkness, and still hold on to a truth, a beauty, a goodness, a holy, though it makes very little sense in the eyes of the world. In fact, it is foolish. It's folly in a certain sense.
Well, when I want to just add to that, because you talk about you talk about existential truth, and I don't know what you mean by you compare it to the truth of the physicist in one point. You say physicists has some truth, then there's existential truth. What's the difference?
Well, we talked about that before. One has to do with the love of power and the love of prediction. The other has to do with the power of love and the power of surrendering. So that when we were talking about purpose tied to the why and prediction tied to the how, it's the same point.
Yeah,
it's the same point there. You see.
Okay, well, look, I'll leave that. I would push that further, but it is getting late. I want to give Robbie a chance. I want to quote
just a quick one right on there, Lawrence. So, I mean, I think when Cornel's talking about existential truth, he's talking about truths about meaning and value. which cannot be reduced to or expressed in equations, that cannot be proven by experimental methods. You have to arrive at them. That's intellective acts, but not those conducted using the methods of the natural sciences.
Using
Yeah,
reason? Would
yeah.
you argue?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. It's
That's the
still
method in
questions of
natural
truth,
sciences.
right? It's still questions of truth. So you're going to be using reason, the noggin, the mind, the
Yeah, as
intellect.
long as we use
You're
reason
going to
and
be
we're
using
willing to be
reasons and
wrong,
arguments. Yeah, but
that's science to me.
it's this set
Reason.
of questions. So existential questions are questions about meaning and value.
That's right.
Okay, about meaning and value. That's okay, good.
Mhm.
Okay, and then we've already had our long discussion about whether you can get at meaning and value. Let me ask, there's a quote from you. I have quotes from all of you that are fascinating, but I just picked two now because it's getting late. You say, Cornell will notice that while I believe that the universe is ordered in a way that it renders it fundamentally intelligible to the inquiring human intellect, it is not so tightly ordered that there are no paradoxes or even absurdities. Could you elaborate, Robert?
Yeah, yeah. So this goes to a difference that Cornell and I have had for a long time, and we've argued back and forth about it. Um, I'm fundamentally an Aristotelian, uh,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and a Thomist. All Thomists are
Yeah.
Aristotelian. Thomas was the great
Yeah.
commentator, really, on Aristotle. Um, and Cornell's fundamentally a Kierkegaardian. Now, what's the difference between the two? I think we can reason our way to the important conclusions. Cornell once said, well, you can reason your way part of the way, but at the end of the day, the crucial moves are the leaps of faith. And that's this difference of sensibility. But then as soon as we start actually arguing with each other, both of us have to introduce caveats. Both of us have to introduce nuances. And pretty soon, these two guys who look like they were just worlds apart philosophically, you had the nuances, you had the caveats, and we're still not in the same place. And I think the reason we're not in the same place has to do with what philosophers call ontology. So how tightly ordered or highly ordered is reality? How penetrable is it to the human intellect in all the domains of science, of literature, of art, and of music, and history, and economics, and so forth. So I don't want to be driven to the ultra. I'm clearly from Cornell's point of view, I'm a rationalist. From my point of view, he's a fideist. But I don't want to be driven to the ultra rationalism where I say, there's nothing paradoxical in human affairs. Everything's so intelligible that it's just a question of when we're going to get there. If we stay determined, stay on track, we're going to eventually get there. And I do think that the world isn't that. At the end of the day, I have to admit the world is not that highly ordered or accessible or penetrable to the human intellect. There are probably some things related to love, for example, and some fundamental questions of meaning. There are probably also some scientific questions that, at the end of the day, we're just not going to be able to penetrate them. They're a paradox. We're going to do the best we can. We're probably going to advance and deepen our knowledge. You would know this better than I. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But in the domains that I do know about, I know that sometimes you kind of hit the wall.
Yeah, no, you
And
hit the wall, but I
you
guess I'm more optimistic than you in that. I mean, that's why I continue science, because I haven't seen a wall yet that we haven't been able to get around. So there may be things. I agree with you. There's certainly the possibility that the human intellect that there'll be limitations to our understanding of the world ultimately. But there's one thing I can say for certain is that we don't know there are. And when people claim to me, and you haven't certainly, but when people tell me we'll never understand love, I always say, how do you know?
oh yeah,
Because
no,
you
I
have to
mean,
understand it to know we're not going to understand it. So you're right. There may be, but
I'm
it's one
never
of the
forgiving
joys of
up.
my life is finding out that you can understand things you didn't think you ever could. And so that search will continue forever. I hope there's forever mystery, and I think there will be. I
Yeah.
think it's a job security thing for science and everything else. Mysteries won't end. And I think I want to end with two quotes from you guys, and then another quote that I think is great. Well, anyway, I think I'm trying to figure. Okay, it's probably brother Robert that said this. It reads more like Robert. Yeah, it does. It said it's better to live in a real world with full knowledge than it is to live in a world of illusion. which I think we all of three of us would agree. Of course, I would say that's the reason I'm not religious, but I won't go there. Except I couldn't resist getting it in there. But
It's
but
just too much dogma for me, Brother Lawrence. Too much
yeah.
dogma.
But Brother Lawrence, let me
Anyway,
ask you this question.
uh,
If you were to believe in an illusion that led toward the enhancing of humanity, as opposed to a disillusion that led toward the destruction of humanity, wouldn't you for a moment draw a distinction between life-enhancing illusions and life-destroying illusions?
I mean, that's a very hypothetical question. Of course, I'd be driven in that direction. Ultimately, however, though, I think how it comes back to bite you in the butt in the end. Ultimately, if you base your actions in the long run on illusions, you're going to produce actions that are counterproductive.
But
I
if we're
think
talking about the destruction of the whole species,
yeah,
then we're not worried about it. We know what the long run is in that hypothetical.
yeah, but I don't think it's. I don't. Yeah, I'll buy what you said. I don't think. I think it's. I don't think it's science that's going to destroy the human species. It's going to be. It's going to be. We may use the tools of science.
We know what it is. It's going to be human greed, and human hatred.
Exactly.
And
it's like my friend Steve Pinker would say. You know, when you talk about science and people say, "Oh, science is bad because it produces X, Y, or Z," he points out, well, you know, architects produce the concentration camps. Does that mean architecture is bad? You know, ultimately, and obviously, it's how you use it.
He's absolutely right about that.
So in the last page of your book, Cornel, you get that. We say we talk about why truth matters. We're really talking about allowing our precious students full access to the great intellectual traditions that will force them to wrestle with what it means to be human in their fallible quest for truth and beauty and goodness and the holy. And, you know, it made me think, you quoted him earlier, but one of my favorite quotes from Rainer Maria Rilke, who I think we all love, is let everything happen to you, beauty and terror. Just keep going. No feeling is final. And that for me is a reason to keep on going, but it's a reason to be able to listen to people like you and have the privilege that your students have to be able to have conversations with you. And for me, it is truly, and I mean this, one of the privileges of my life that I've been able to be in a position to have this conversation with the two of you. And it is.
That's right. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's really,
our honor.
It's been great, and it's an example of what your book is all about, which is the dialogue and respectful dialogue. And I hope that someday we can continue it in person. But it's been such a privilege.
We should.
This has been a great 2 hours and 40 minutes. They've flown by.
You've been marvelous, Brother Lawrence, and the dialogue. And we just hope that people listening in could be unsettled and unnerved. We make it very clear. We don't believe in safe spaces. We want Socratic spaces. People are respected, but they're unnerved. They're unsettled.
Unnerved and unsettled. In fact, you know, I knew we were kindred spirits, Cornel, when I heard from Robert quoting you. Because I actually have said this, and I've seen it on coffee cups now when people quote me. But I said the purpose of education is to make us uncomfortable, and he quoted you saying the purpose of education is to make you unsettled, which I like your word too. We couldn't be in more agreement, and it's a lovely unsettlement. Thank you, gentlemen. We'll one day have a beer or something together.
No, thank you,
I appreciate the time you took. And it's
a cognac in the name of Chekhov. Cognac in the name of Chekhov.
Okay. Well, cognac is fine. Even one single malt whiskey is fine with me. But I guess I feel especially lucky that you were willing to take the time to spend the time and go extra. So thank you very much. I think I can't imagine this time will go by really quickly for anyone who listens. It's been it'll be wonderful. Thank you so much.
But we thank you,
Lawrence.
Thank you.
Definitely. You stay strong, though, Brother Lawrence.
You stay strong too, both of you. Keep up the good work inside academia and outside of academia. Amen. We'll all try and fight the good fight, and I keep trying to.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Oh, this is wonderful.
Hi, it's Lawrence again. As the Origins podcast continues to reach millions of people around the world, I just wanted to say thank you. It's because of your support, whether you listen or watch, that we're able to help enrich the perspective of listeners by providing access to the people and ideas that are changing our understanding of ourselves and our world and driving the future of our society in the 21st century. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can also leave us private feedback on our website if you'd like to see any parts of the podcast improved. Finally, if you'd like to access ad-free and bonus content, become a paid subscriber at origensproject.org. This podcast is produced by the Origins Project Foundation as a nonprofit effort committed to enhancing public literacy and engagement with the world by connecting science and culture. You can learn more about our events, our travel excursions, and ways to get involved at origensproject.org. Thank you.